From 1936 to 1938, Joseph E. Davies served as the American ambassador to the USSR. A longtime friend of President FDR, Davies was personally tasked as a political outsider to revive Soviet-American diplomatic relations. To the dismay of the establishment U.S. foreign diplomats, Davies often openly praised the Soviet experiment despite being a staunch New Deal liberal. He couldn't help but state the obvious. The Soviet system was working for the Soviet people. In late 1941, 3 years after his ambassadorship ended and mere months after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Davies felt compelled to publish a short article in an American magazine titled "How Russia Blasted Hitler's Spy Machine." In it, he reflected on the series of high-profile trials against Soviet agents that took place in the USSR under his tenure. Western media today, as they did 80 years ago, almost exclusively portrays these court proceedings as a series of sham show trials. Former U.S. Ambassador Davies, a witness to these proceedings, was of a different opinion. We reproduce the majority of his article to open this episode. A few days after Hitler's attack on Soviet Russia, I was asked the question, what about fifth columnists in Russia? Off the anvil, I replied, there aren't any, they shot them. There is, when you think about it, a unique feature in this latest Nazi stab in the back. Not a word has appeared about any inside work for the Nazis behind the Russian lines. There's been no so-called internal aggression in Russia, cooperating with the German High Command. There were no Sudeten Highlands, no Czechoslovakian Hachas, Barons, or Chevolkovskis, no Slovakian Tisos, no Belgian Degres, no Norwegian Quieslings in the Soviet picture. With this thought in mind, I recently went through my diary, with the permission of the State Department, and reread some of my reports as an American ambassador to Moscow in 1937 and 1938. Suddenly I saw the picture as I undoubtedly should have seen it at the time in Russia. Much of the world construed the famous treason trials and purges from 1935 to 1938 to be outrageous examples of barbarism, ingratitude, and hysteria. Now it appears that they indicated the amazing far-sightedness of Stalin and his close associates. In the light of present facts and after an examination of the record, there can be no doubt that those defendants were, directly or indirectly, in the employ of the German and Japanese high commands. Practically every device of the German fifth column as we know it in Europe, South America, and even the United States was disclosed in the testimony of the Soviet quislings. But the Russians were acutely aware of the menace as early as 1935. As fast as the Germans and Japanese built, the Russians destroyed. That, in brief, is the real story behind the Russian purges, and one of the chief explanations for the magnificent Russian Renaissance to the Nazi juggernaut. I attended the treason trials probably more assiduously than any other member of the diplomatic corps, but all of us there in Moscow at the time, including the diplomats and the able newspaper correspondents, seemed to have missed the boat. I certainly did. There were 2 counts in the indictments in these trials. The first had to do with the internal revolutionary activities of the defendants, and the second charged that they had conspired and cooperated with Germany and Japan to betray Russia and acquire power for themselves through a successful military attack upon the Soviet Union. In my reports, I find that I referred to the second charges quite casually and as of comparatively little importance. One reason was that the phrases descriptive of the Nazi techniques, such as fifth column and internal aggression, were unfamiliar to our thoughts then. These terms came to have meaning for us only after we saw these activities in the conquest of one after another of the victims of Hitler's diplomacy and military prowess. It was only after the taking of Prague that we began to recognize the fact that there had existed in Germany, as part of the Foreign Office, under the administration of a man named Ernst Bohl, a huge organization for fifth column instruction. It was in fact a school for the purpose of instructing Germans and German agents in the methods and techniques of propaganda and for the breakdown of morale. And undoubtedly, in the even more sinister methods of aggression, all were designed to weaken the victim before attack and to supply centers of traitors' help back of the lines. This school was the campus for fifth columnists, but not many of us knew it, and relatively few paid any attention to it at the time. It was only recently that the Dies Committee uncovered the activities of these German organizations in this country. Another reason why we in Moscow failed at the time to grasp the full significance of the treason trials was that we all seemed to be thinking in terms of the struggle for power that was going on within Russia, between the ins and the outs, between Stalin on the one hand, and on the other the late Leon Trotsky, who had been exiled early in 1928 and was mysteriously murdered in Mexico last year. One of the primary issues between Trotsky and Stalin was the question of which policy the Soviet Union should pursue. Stalin, a practical realist, was convinced that his primary job was to develop socialist democracy and make communism work within Soviet Russia. Trotsky, on the other hand, was an extreme advocate of world revolution and held that communism could not be successful if surrounded by capitalist states. We knew that Trotsky had a great many followers in Russia, and we regarded the treason trials as Stalin's method of destroying his internal enemies. Talk of cooperation with the German and Japanese high commands seemed like so much bizarre window dressing, a facade to cover the liquidating of counter-revolutionaries. But, like everybody who discounts the devilish ingenuity of the Germans in waging war within the borders of their enemies, we were mistaken. The testimony at the trials revealed that Trotsky had been planning to take advantage of a great European war to foment revolution within Russia and oust Stalin. But when the war didn't come in 1936 and 1937, he grew tired of waiting and played into the hands of the Nazis by contacting the German general staff. Working through Red Army leaders inside Russia, Trotsky agreed to cooperate with the Germans and pave the way through espionage and sabotage for an effective invasion. Indicative of the degree to which the Soviet government was alarmed by these subversive activities is the fact that Stalin, at that time, completely reversed a policy laid down in 1926. Prior to the banishment of Trotsky in 1928, many of Stalin's associates urged that Trotsky be tried for treason. To this Stalin replied in effect, quote, "No, we must not do that. When the leaders of the French Revolution began to kill each other, it was the beginning of the end. The Soviet Revolution must not chew up its own children. We will not do it." End quote. From 1927 to 1935, that policy was sustained. But it changed suddenly when the Russian leaders learned of the activities of the Fifth Column, and there followed the trials, the purges, and executions, which were pressed with the greatest vigor and relentlessness. When they were over, the Fifth Column had been smashed once and for all, and the road was clear to build up the magnificent morale and the military machine that is checkmating the Germans today. The fireworks started in December 1934 with the murder of Stalin's personal friend, a man by the name of Sergei Kirov, who was the Soviet leader for the Leningrad district. The result was that the trial of the murderer and a group of prominent Soviet leaders, formerly associated with Trotsky, who were charged with aiding and abetting in the crime and in a conspiracy to overthrow the Stalin government. They were judged guilty and 16 were shot. Subsequently, in January 1937, apparently as a result of investigations arising out of this trial, 17 men, including 5 or 6 prominent leaders, as well as a number of engineers and professional killers, were tried on similar charges of conspiracy and treason. This was the so-called Radek trial, named for one of the best-known prisoners, Karl Radek, a brilliant communist and editor of a great Moscow newspaper. 13 of the defendants were shot, and 3 were given terms of 10 years. Another year passed, and in March 1938 came the Bukharin trial, in which the chief defendant was Nikolai Bukharin, another prominent intellectual and editor. 18 of these defendants were shot, among them Bukharin, One was given a term of 25 years, and 2 others were given terms of 15 years. It was these last 2 trials that I attended. The Radek trial, which lasted 6 days, was drenched with drama. The sessions were held in a long, high-ceilinged room, which had formerly been part of a fashionable Moscow club of the old regime. I sat with the diplomatic corps just in front of the newspapermen, not more than 12 feet from the prisoner's dock. The testimonies and confessions of these defendants were startling. They all pleaded guilty, literally beating their breasts as they heaped guilt upon themselves. But as a trained lawyer, not without experience in testing the credibility of witnesses in criminal trials, I watched the defendants' faces, studied their conduct on the stand, and I arrived at the conclusion that the state had unquestionably proved their case. As a matter of fact, on the record, it would be difficult for me to conceive how any court could have done other than judge the defendants guilty as charged. To have assumed that the proceedings were staged as political fiction would be to presuppose the creative genius of Shakespeare. The indictment at the Bukharin trial was similar to that of the preceding trial. It charged conspiracy to overthrow the Stalin government by the defendants, but charged with much greater detail the alleged treason of the defendants in conspiracy with Germany and Japan. The conspirators confessed that under the leadership of Trotsky they had 1. Agreed to aid Germany and Japan in the military attack on Russia, 2. Cooperated in plans to assassinate Stalin and Molotov, 3. Planned a military uprising in the Kremlin led by General Tukhachevsky, then second in command of the Red Army, 4. Directed sabotage of industries, blowing up chemical plants, destruction of coal mines, wrecking of transportation facilities, and other subversive activities. 5. Taken orders from the German General Staff. 6. Passed on military information to the German and Japanese intelligence services. 7. Cooperated with German representatives in espionage and sabotage. The plan, in short, contemplated complete cooperation with Germany. The conspirators, as a reward, were allowed to take over smaller but technically independent Soviet states, which would turn over White Russia and Ukraine to Germany, and the maritime provinces and the Sakhalin oil fields to Japan. Further, after German conquest, German firms were to receive concessions and favors in connection with the development of iron ore, manganese, oil, coal, timber, and other great resources of the Soviet Union. If these original fifth columnists had succeeded in their plans, Germany would be poised today for the final attack upon Great Britain with the natural wealth of the Russian territory behind her. To appreciate fully the character and significance of this testimony, it should be borne in mind that the confessions came not from obscure, impoverished citizens ready to betray their country for a few marks, but from such prominent personalities as 2 cabinet members, the Commissar of the Treasury, the Commissar of Foreign Trade, a former Premier of the government, 2 former ambassadors who had served in London, Paris, and Tokyo, a former Undersecretary of the State, and the Acting Secretary of the State of the government, as well as 2 of the Soviet Union's foremost editors. It was as if the Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau and Secretary of Commerce Jones, Undersecretary of State Wells, Ambassador Phillips, Ambassador Winant, and Secretary to the President Early confessed conspiring with Germany to cooperate in an invasion of the United States. Here are a few excerpts from the testimony in open court which are revealing. Krestinsky, Undersecretary of State, quote, I established espionage connections with the Germans on the direct instructions of Trotsky. We came to an agreement that we would help the Reichswehr create a number of espionage bases on the territory of the USSR by permitting the unhindered entry of spies by the Reichswehr, and that we would supply the Reichswehr with espionage materials, that is, to put it plainly, that we would be German spies. In return, the Reichswehr undertook to pay us 250,000 marks a year, end quote. Rosengotz, Commissar of Foreign Trade, quote, I handed various secret information to the Commander-in-Chief of the Reichswehr, Siecht, and to the Chief of the German General Staff, Haas. I received instructions from Trotsky through Krestinsky to carry on wrecking activities in the sphere of foreign trade with the object of rendering direct assistance to Germany and Japan, end quote. Besenov, Counselor of the Soviet Embassy at Berlin, quote, Krestinsky told me that the agreement reached by the Trotskyites with the German National Socialist Party on the possibility of hastening war, which would facilitate the coming to power of the Trotskyites, must be expedited at all costs. End quote. Grinko, Commissar of Finance, quote, "One of the organizers of the Ukrainian National Fascist Organization, I operated particularly in the Ukraine, at the main gates through which German fascism is preparing its blow against the USSR," end quote. Minor defendants confessed that they had connection with the German and Japanese intelligence services and cooperated with them in systematic espionage and sabotage. For instance, one official stated that he had organized 2 explosions at fertilizer plants, which entailed enormous property losses as well as the loss of human life. Another assumed responsibility for disasters at the chemical plant. A third described the manner in which cadres or centers were organized for the purpose of cooperating with the German invaders when they arrived. Still another told how he had planned and wrecked troop trains on the express directions from foreign intelligence services. Among the routine orders which this last conspirator had received were instructions not only to, quote, organize incendiarism in the military stores, canteens, and army shipments, end quote, but also to use, quote, bacteriological means in time of war, with the object of contaminating troop trains and army camps with virulent bacilli, end quote. From the testimony, it was disclosed that contact between the German High Command and General Tukhachevsky had been established through Trotsky. The names of some of the highest general officers of the Red Army Command were brought into the case with testimony that they had been corrupted or otherwise induced to enter the conspiracy. The Russian leaders proceeded to clean house and acted with the greatest of energy and precision. Voroshilov said later, quote, "It is easier for a burglar to break into the house if he has an accomplice to let him in. We have taken care of the accomplices," end quote. It was suddenly announced in April 1937 that General Tukhachevsky, who had been designated by the government to attend the coronation in London as the representative of the USSR, would not go to London. He was reported to have been sent down to command the army of the Volga district, but it was understood at the time that he had been removed from the train and arrested before he arrived at his command. Within a few weeks thereafter, on June 11th, along with 11 other officers of the High Command, he was shot after a court-martial. Many commentators have concluded that the purges seriously weakened the Red Army. I believe that the exact opposite is the truth. The house-cleaning of traitors eliminated some of the highest commanders, but it brought about the promotion of younger and frequently more imaginative men who, while lacking the experience of their predecessors, made up for it in initiative and loyalty. The purges also gave the average soldier a greater sense of security, and the conviction that his fate was now in the hands of more trustworthy officers than, quote, the Trotskyite traitors who met the fate they deserved, end quote. In connection with morale, you must remember that most soldiers are less than 30 years old. Thus, in Russia, the average soldier would not have been more than 6 years old when the communists seized the government in 1917. During all his youth, he is taught blind, unquestioning loyalty to the Soviet regime. The result is that he doesn't dream of analyzing the acts of his government. When the government brands a man a traitor, the man is a traitor, and nobody bothers his head about the details. The extensive military and industrial preparations that were launched immediately after the smoke of the purges cleared away go far to explain the Russians' resistance today and their ability to withstand German science and German panzer divisions. But this all-out program could easily have been nullified if Stalin and his associates had not cleaned out all treasonable elements within the country 3 years before the invasion was launched. Today, when the Russian generals order a bridge blown up or a section of earth scorched, the bridges are blown and the earth is scorched. There are no saboteurs, secret agents, or fifth columnists to cooperate with the invaders, because the Russians were sufficiently far-sighted to eliminate them before it was too late. That is a fact which other liberty-loving nations might well ponder.
Welcome to Prolespod.
Welcome back to Prolespod. This is Ray. This episode is part 3.5 of the Stalin Eras, an ongoing special event chronicling the history of the USSR and the life of its longest-serving leader, Joseph Stalin. Each of these Stalin Eras episodes builds upon the last in terms of themes and narratives, as well as the general trajectory of both Joseph Stalin and the socialist project to which he dedicated his life. For that reason, while we understand that some folks might be particularly interested in one era or another, we do suggest listening to the episodes in order so that you are better able to understand the complex tapestry of connecting threads which make up the big picture. So, if you've somehow stumbled on this without listening to the beginning, we highly recommend you start with episode 63, The Stalin Eras, an Introduction, 1878 to 1917. War is Already Here is the title of this narrative. A title we believe captures both Stalin's mindset as well as the material reality faced by the USSR during these years. We will be covering 1936 through 1939 in part 3.5, focusing in detail on the ins and outs of the various trials of anti-Soviet agents, revealing new archival information not yet readily accessible, which demonstrates, contrary to popular opinion, their legitimacy. By the end of this episode, we will have followed up on the international geopolitical threads spun in the previous narrative, which will come together in the eventual signing of the controversial Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By the way, if you like our work and you want to support our show, we ask that you head over to patreon.com, where starting from just $5 a month, you can get access to bonus content, Q&A episodes, the Theory Beats project, surprise drops, and other things that you won't find anywhere else. If you don't have the discretionary income to support our work, no problem. Even the free tier has access to the study guides. Head over to patreon.com/Prolespod.
The Moscow Trials. One discussant during the drafting of the new Soviet constitution, Maslenikov, argued that granting electoral rights to kulaks and having secret elections might allow foreign elements to be elected to the local administration. He therefore contended that if the state were to give kulaks the right to vote, it needed to be through open rather than secret elections. Another party member, D.A. Shabalin, considered it fully inappropriate to allow the former Lishentsy, who were deprived of their rights because of their social character, to be elected, as they might utilize the organs of the worker state to serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. These examples, which were in no way fringe opinions, reflected the instability in the countryside and anxiety about the lingering influence of former ruling and privileged classes. Citizens who opposed the expansion of voting rights utilized party messages addressing the struggle between forward-thinking workers and peasants against the remnants of the old regime to justify their opposition, protesting that the people who had benefited under the Tsar and capitalism were untrustworthy. One collective farmer suggested segregating people who had fought against the Bolsheviks during the war and formulating a special article to prevent their participation in elections. Another asked the state to restrict voting rights of former merchants, landlords, as well as factory and mine owners because, quote, all of them are enemies of laborers and must not have the right to vote or be elected, end quote. Nor were religious people trusted by party members. Yet another collective farmer recommended that members of religious cults not be granted voting rights, since, quote, at the present time, they are still not familiar with work and continue to befog the heads of the laborers, end quote. Another agreed that cult members, quote, who today pull the wool over the heads of the laborers, end quote, should not be eligible to stand for election. I.P. Plotnikov, a worker and party member, summed up this distrust, arguing that members of religious cults should not be eligible to be elected, quote, as religion is an irreconcilable enemy of socialism, end quote. Throughout this period of international intrigue, the Soviet Union also found itself in a whirlpool of bitter domestic strife. The ripples of impact from the decisions made during this era are impossible to calculate, but we will do our best to position and frame them within their epoch. In mid-January 1935, the leadership of the insurgent cell known as the Zinoviev Center were convicted. Grigory Zinoviev was sentenced to 10 years in prison for forming an illegal opposition to the CPSU, conspiring to commit terrorist acts, and being directly responsible for the assassination of Kirov. G.E. Evdokimov, I.P. Bakayev, and Lev Kamenev were also sentenced to 8, and 5 years respectively. The second part of the trial took place on January 23rd, targeting the leadership of the NKVD in Leningrad. 12 were tried for having received information about the preparations for the attempt on Kirov, as well as having failed to take the necessary measures to prevent the assassination, despite having every possible means of arresting it. Given the crimes, these sentences were also very light. Baltsevich got 10 years in prison, and the other 11 received between 2 and 3 years each. But the sentences of 2 agents in particular, Zaporozhets and Medved, under the orders of Yagoda, were especially odd. Despite having been convicted of having prior knowledge of the assassination and not acting upon it, they were given each 2 years. They were taken from their holding cells, not by a car meant for prisoners, but in a much more luxurious government vehicle. When they arrived at the White Sea Canal camps, Medved came by train in a special compartment. According to one prisoner there, he stayed in the personal room of the overseer of the complex, Rappaport, and was wearing an NKVD uniform without insignia. The pair of former agents then went on to Solvetsk in the same privileged manner, before moving on to Kolyma, once the ice of the Okhotsk Sea made that trip possible. There, they were given important posts immediately. Zaporozhets, in particular, was head of the road-building administration within the complex. 2 days after the NKVD trials, Sergei Mrachovsky, boss of the Trotsky printing presses in 1927, was arrested. Walter Kravitsky defected from the Soviet Union in 1937, gleefully cooperating with U.S. intelligence. He gave the Western powers his prediction based upon personal knowledge of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He aided the British in arresting Soviet agent John Herbert King, and eventually Donald Maclean, as well as John Cairncross. He claimed that Stalin was involved in Kirov's assassination, which we now know is unequivocally false. He also claimed that Mrachovsky was interrogated for 90 hours by NKVD officers under instruction to force him to confess to being a terrorist, with Stalin calling every couple of hours to find out if he had broken. A process which would have been quite difficult considering Stalin was in between the 16th Congress of the Russian Soviets and the beginning of the 7th Congress of the Soviets of the USSR, less than 5 days, during which he was in a special Politburo session. Stalin was advocating for secret elections to be included in the upcoming constitution against Pavel Yanukids, who suggested open, uncontested elections. But even beyond that, thanks to a massive release of previously classified materials, we now know that when Mrachovsky was arrested and his belongings were subsequently searched, officials discovered notebooks dedicated to and filled with the addresses of Trotskyists still operating in the USSR. They found an extensive, systematized archive of both the illegal Trotskyite Center from the late 1920s, as well as Smirnov's group, which Soviet officials believed had been liquidated in 1933. They found original copies of documents related to supposedly rehabilitated Trotskyists who had been sent abroad by the party, as well as correspondence related to organizing with Trotsky, Rakovsky, Muralov, Beloborodov, and other leading Trotskyites. And that isn't the end of it. In fact, many of these revelations will change the way in which we view this period dramatically. For example, the idea that these trials were based upon confessions, typically referred to as forced confessions, with no material evidence, is demonstrably false. The reason as to why most evidence was not presented to the public, we will discuss briefly in a bit, and then in depth during the conclusion episode of the Stalin Eras. When, on the night of December 16th, 1934, the first wave of members of the Trotskyite Zinovievite counter-revolutionary organization were arrested, a subsequent search uncovered several firearms with ammunition and various documents and letters implicating them in the broader conspiracy. And we must remember, this group veiled itself heavily. As their work was conspiratorial in nature, physical evidence would have been logically difficult to come by, but not impossible, as this list clearly indicates. Let us now consult our favorite right deviationist and anti-Stalin agitator, Grigory Tokayev, from his 1955 memoir, Betrayal of an Ideal, as to whether a Zinovievite cell existed in Leningrad, and what their intent might have been. I returned to Moscow from the Caucasus early in October 1934. Not only was I not rested, I had worn myself out and grown much thinner. The inward tension and the incessant need for vigilance had exhausted me. Now to my other anxieties was added something I had never anticipated. I found myself at a conference of the military underground. No special approach was made in advance. I was merely taken on a plausible pretext to a place the existence of which I could never have suspected. The sense of having been observed and chosen, even though it was by people who were prominent in the state and whose views I largely shared, was in itself disturbing. Equally so was the further proof which this meeting afforded to the importance of the opposition and the fact that we were, perhaps, on the verge of great events. The conference was presided over by an army officer of the highest rank. I found myself among people who, until that instant, I had believed to be completely loyal Stalinists. Among them was an exceptionally beautiful young woman to whom her husband, ADC, had presented me at a party during the last May Day festivities. I had danced with her once or twice, and she had then invited me to her house, saying with a laugh, "You needn't be worried, my husband isn't jealous." Now I discovered what this meant. Her husband was a key figure in this military underground conference. As I sat next to her, I was overwhelmed with the realization of how true it was that Stalin, Molotov, and Kirov could trust nobody. It occurred to me to wonder at the great distance I myself had traveled from my initial loyalty to the regime. It must indeed have been a long way if these people, to whom I owed no allegiance, thus trusted me. How confident they already felt of me was revealed later in the evening. Publicly, before the whole meeting, with military curtness, they put to me a question to perform a certain action. What, I cannot state here, which was necessary for their anti-Stalin work. Was I ready for such a step? Never before had I been called upon to make so momentous a decision at such short notice and in so little time. I knew that such a request as theirs could be made only if it was unavoidable. I also realized what my refusal would mean. They would never trust me again, and the proof they had just given me of their confidence was priceless to me. I said I would do what they wanted, whenever they wished. In the name of the assembled men and women, the chairman thanked me. What was required of me was quite simple and concrete. The preparations were not my concern, and they were to take some time. In October, I was told that, for an unforeseen reason, the event had to be put off until November. Then there was another postponement, and then a third. We do not know for certain what happened in October and November which would require a postponement on the part of this conspiracy involving top military leaders. It could have been something as simple as an internal concern about tactics. Still, we do have theories. In October of 1934, the Central Committee, which included Kirov, decided that the ease by which enemies were able to fake membership in the party was unacceptable. As such, the party needed to initiate a new registration of members and subsequently develop better controls. Perhaps this gave the conspirators anxiety that their machinations had been revealed to the party leadership. Remember, according to the testimony of the assassin Nikolaev, as well as that of his wife, preparations for the assassination began in April of that year. After all, it was a revoked party membership card which granted Nikolaev access to the Smolny Institute on the day he murdered Kirov. During his trial in 1938, Yagoda confessed to ordering Zaporozhets, in 1934, assistant chief of the Leningrad NKVD at the time, not to place any obstacles in the way of terrorist acts against Kirov. This, according to Yagoda, included ordering Nikolaev to be released after he had been arrested with a revolver, cartridges, and a chart of the route typically taken by Kirov to work. This arrest occurred in October of 1934, and police records, along with the 1989 memoir of NKVD agent Alexei Rybin, both corroborate Yagoda's testimony. Further, Kirov's personal bodyguard, Borisov, was killed in an automobile accident on his way to the Smolny Institute the day after Kirov's murder. Borisov was on his way to give account of all the difficulties he had had in getting to the institute the day before. The automobile accident occurred while he was riding in the back of an NKVD truck. He suffered fatal head injuries. The other passengers and the driver were not injured at all. Yagoda would implicate Zaporozhets in Borisov's death. After Kirov's assassination, Tokayev informs us of the depth of the conspiracy. There was indeed no doubt as to the seriousness of the assassination of Kirov, perhaps the most serious since the Soviet Union had been founded. The shot which had killed Kirov was aimed not only at him, but at the very heart of the Politburo. He was perhaps the best orator among the leaders, and the most loyal, most consistent, and most fanatical Stalinist in the country. He was also a magnificent organizer. Let us briefly return to Yagoda, because he plays a major role in the tangle of conspiracies and terror. Genrikh Yagoda had only been head of the NKVD and the GPU which preceded it since May of 1934. Previously, he had served as deputy under Vyacheslav Menjinsky. According to Robert Conquest, of all people, Yagoda was, quote, exceptionally interested in poisons, end quote. He had been a pharmacist before the revolution. Conquest believes that Yagoda and the Kremlin plot, which we will address momentarily, were, quote, one crime which appeared to be possibly genuine, end quote. Then, by extension, we can probably believe former NKVD officer Rybin when he wrote, with the help of the associate Bulanov, Yagoda tried hard to get rid of Menjinsky, who suffered greatly from asthma and bronchitis. After getting rid of Menjinsky through poison, Yagoda was now free to do his evil deeds while masking himself in the cloak of a Bolshevik, patriot, and falsifying documents in court. Rybin also complained of Yagoda's orders to the agents. While terrorist investigations typically took at least 30 days, Yagoda ordered them done in 10. Trotskyite and anti-Soviet Ante Chiliga, whom we met in Part 2 of the Stalin Eras, wrote in his memoir that after the conviction of Zinoviev and Kamenev, they were sent to the Verkhney Uralsk political prison, where Chiliga was being held. He reported that Zinoviev arrived with a bunch of books on fascism, a subject in which he was showing special interest. More on that later. At the same time as those connected with Kirov's murder were arrested, another 100 people were arrested and tried in a closed trial. The verdict was handed down and they were all shot. This sent shockwaves through circles of the less convicted citizens of the Union. Capital punishment had not been used often since the conclusion of the Civil War. It sent ripples through the rest of the world as well. The capitalist press latched onto it as a gotcha regarding so-called communist oppression. What was not known to any of them, perhaps a mistake on the part of the Soviet government, was that the people arrested and executed had no connection to Zinoviev nor Kirov's murder. They were a mixture of former white guards and white sympathizers dispatched by the Nazis to cross the borders of Poland, Latvia, and Finland into the USSR. According to Soviet diplomat to England, Ivan Maisky's diary, the governments of all three countries assisted these terrorists in their crossing. Once the monarchists had crossed, they were to make contact with conspirators from among Soviet citizens. Additionally, over the previous months, there had been a number of assassination attempts on Stalin, Voroshilov, Molotov, and others. But the USSR could not bring the terrorists to open trial without risking a stoking of the conflict with Germany, as well as the three states through which the whites had crossed. Maisky wrote at the end of this entry, "Our policy is a policy of peace. We do not want to risk peace because of the machinations of terrorists paid by the Nazis. To shoot 80 to 100 people is, of course, a difficult and unpleasant thing, but it is still better than to risk the lives of millions of workers and peasants on the battlefield. We must never forget the beautiful words of French revolutionary Mirabeau, who 140 years ago said that a revolution cannot be made of lavender oil." And perhaps this paradox best describes the policy of the Soviet Union during wartime. Later that year, someone asked Anna Louise Strong why so many people were executed after the Kirov assassination. She replied, 103 persons were executed as members of murder gangs who crossed the Soviet border with revolvers and hand grenades to commit murder and other acts of violence against the communist and Soviet officials. Such gangs have existed ever since the revolution drove out the White Guard armies, but Berlin gave them shelter after Hitler came to power. They have for 2 years, since Hitler's ascension, been bragging in newspapers in Berlin and Yugoslavia of their successes in murder and destruction beyond the Soviet frontier. These cases were handled by border guards until the assassination of Kirov aroused a storm of popular resolutions calling for drastic action against the terrorists. A court-martial, composed of well-known members of the Supreme Court, thereupon made rapid cleanup of all these cases in several cities, publishing the fact that the terrorists had been armed when arrested, had run the border from Poland and Romania, and had plotted and carried out murders. The trials were secret, since the open discussion of details was tantamount to accusing several governments of acts that rank as causes of war. There is this persistent belief, even among more sympathetic communists, that the true conspiracy did not begin until mid to late 1936, when Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov discovered the depth of it. But this is false. In February of 1935, surveillance of foreign nationals arriving in Moscow established a link between a handful of Polish citizens suspected of being Polish intelligence officers and the director of the Central Clinic of the Kremlin Sanitary Department, a Dr. David Tates. This, in turn, led to a Shaja Spiegel, who was working as a contractor for Intourist, and according to GPU reports from 1931, was an agent of the German secret police. Dr. Tates then led to Grufferman, expelled from the RSFSR in 1920 for criminal activity while operating as a member of a Czech trade delegation. Grufferman, who the NKVD report states is undoubtedly connected with Polish counterintelligence, had recently filled out a visa application at the plenipotentiary mission in Warsaw. Dr. Tates was removed from work at the Kremlin. In March of 1935, in the Vitebsk region of the Belarus SSR, a technician of the Vitebsk Air Brigade asked to be dismissed from the military after, according to his diary, the commander of the brigade, whom he had confronted, suggested that he should work with their right-wing military conspiracy group because the alternative would be to fall into the hands of, quote, those that come after, end quote. We can now assume the commander referred to the Nazis or perhaps the Japanese. We want you to hold in your mind the names which the technician listed in his diary as we continue. Army Commander Uborovich, Commissar of the Navy Peter Smirnov, not to be confused with prominent and public oppositionist Vladimir Smirnov, Army Commander Alksnis, Military Council Member Troyanker, Marshal Tukhachevsky, Chief of the Political Department of the Red Army Jan Gamarnik, People's Commissar of Internal Affairs at the time, and a nebulous others he didn't want to name. Also in March 1935, a letter to the OGPU dated to 1933 was dug up after a source in the Kremlin mentioned that the cleaning crew was gossiping about, quote, slander overheard from employees of the Kremlin library. The letter revealed an apparent infiltration of the library by Kamenev's sister-in-law, former Princess Bebutova, who had since changed her name to Rosenfeld, along with another former noblewoman and daughter of a Kolchak officer who had served in Czech counterintelligence. According to testimony from Kamenev's brother, the princess' husband, Kamenev, repeatedly told her that the only way out of the country's difficult situation was the elimination of Stalin. This was, according to Kamenev's brother, the reason for their infiltration. And yet, by April, Stalin, as always, maintained his pragmatism and sent a warning that, quote, excesses are not permitted, end quote, in the campaigns of arrests and deportations. At the end of that March, an investigation was initiated into the secret expenditures of the Central Executive Committee. This investigation was overseen by two men, Alyakov and Avol Yanukidze, the latter of which was the head of the CEC and godfather to Stalin's wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. They discovered that, in 1934, the fund exceeded its allocated budget by 1.6 million rubles. Worse, a large percentage of the budget, which was intended for cultural and educational purposes, as well as for, quote, improving daily life, end quote, for citizens of the USSR, was instead used for lunches, parties, and unqualified payments to theater employees, writers, ballet dancers, exiled citizens, and their families. One of the individuals who received such a payment was implicated in the library ring from earlier that month. In June, based upon this new evidence and testimony, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others who had previously been arrested in December 1934 and January 1935 were brought back to face questioning and a new secret trial. This time, they were implicated not only more closely with the Kirov assassination, but also in cooperation with foreign powers. Still, nothing concrete was established, and they were acquitted of those charges. When Zinoviev was sent back to prison, he was put into solitary confinement on the 10th of July. Later in June, in a resolution drafted and signed by both Molotov and Stalin titled, quote, on the procedure of making arrests, end quote, took the warning from April and made it official policy. This amendment stated that arrests in all cases, without exception, can henceforth be carried out only with the consent of the relevant prosecutor. If it is necessary to make an arrest at the scene of a crime, officials from the NKVD authorized to do so by law are obliged to immediately report the arrest to the appropriate prosecutor for confirmation. The amendment goes on to require explicit approval for arrests of members of the CC and Politburo, of officers and enlisted personnel in the Red Army, of any citizens of the autonomous republics, of railway and water transport personnel, as well as many others. This, in our opinion, constitutes an unusual strategy for individuals who were supposedly extracting false confessions to persecute oppositionists in a mass purge. Regardless, oppositionists across the globe were dwindling because the USSR continued to shine as a beacon of possibility. Between the successes of the first five-year plan, the new constitution, and the positive results of the second five-year plan beginning to show, isolation and failure made the opposition desperate. The rest of the year was quiet as they regrouped and began planning for a path forward. By July, the Soviet government had delayed the Comintern. According to U.S. Ambassador to Moscow, Bullitt, because the Soviet government had an intense fear of Japanese attack. A few days later, the head of the Japanese embassy in Moscow, Sako, came to see Bullitt and told him that he had been given information from an absolutely authoritative source that the Comintern would meet on the 20th. Sako claimed that he had seen a copy of the resolutions which would be proposed and gave Bullitt a quick summary. The intelligence turned out to be genuine. Browder and Foster from the Communist Party USA were present and planning to speak out against the United States. Bullitt needed to get his ass in gear, bullying Soviet Ambassador Litvinov. And it worked. Secretary of the Comintern and later president of the based German Democratic Republic, Wilhelm Pieck, referenced, quote, Englishmen and Negroes, end quote, as among the, quote, great communist family, end quote, in his speech, without specifically calling out the United States. The passing of the Johnson Act in 1934 prevented U.S. citizens and institutions from lending money to any nation which had not paid their war debts. As such, the U.S. government had been highly motivated to pressure the USSR to pay debts incurred by the provisional government during the 7 whole months in which it held power. And given the economic conditions in the U.S. during this time, it is difficult to fault them. Litvinov had consistently rebuffed Bullitt on this matter, as not only was the debt not theirs, but the second 5-year plan was already underway, and so the need for foreign loans was limited. And yet, Bullitt wrote about a brief flash of optimism, which would last 1 day before Litvinov again shot him down. I have no indication of interest in revival of credit negotiations except from Osinski, Radek, and Bukharin, who dined with me recently. Osinski, at the moment, is considered the leading Soviet authority on the United States, and his intense interest in this subject seemed to me to indicate that the Kremlin was interested. These anecdotes, the intelligence leaks to Sako and the odd behavior of this trio of Soviet citizens mentioned by Bullitt, on their own, they mean very little. But taken as individual threads comprising the overall tapestry of conspiracy, a picture begins to take shape. On August 22nd, Zinoviev finally began to admit to direct participation versus the moral complicity for which he was sentenced, albeit very slowly. He began with an admission that when he was sent again into exile in 1932, Tomsky connected him with the foreign department of a Soviet publishing house, Sotsegis. The purpose was to negotiate the translation and publication of Mein Kampf into Russian. He said that Tomsky indicated that the Sotsegis employee was, quote, our guy from Slepkov's group, end quote. Zinoviev went on to connect Evdokimov to himself and a number of others, as well as connecting Kamenev to Sokolnikov. Remember, Shiliga's memoir noted that when Zinoviev arrived in the political isolator, he brought with him a bunch of books on fascism. The methods of communication for the conspirators were manifold. For some, such as Sedov and Olberg, they wrote on postcards from, quote, the old man, end quote, with characters upside down or in between lines to indicate names or addresses. If the subject matter was damning enough, they might hide communications inside a book. Others used a cipher based on Latin letters written in milk. They were all, within each organization, divided into 5 cells. Virtually none of the cells were aware of the membership or movements of the others. In late November, after 2 months of unwinding one block of Trotskyites and Ukrainian nationalists, which spanned the arrest of 32 folks, a non-party former teacher at the Theater Technical School in Kiev, who had since moved to Gorky, testified that when he left, he transferred leadership of the insurgent group to a Nirchuk, with recruitment assigned to Samoilovich. Over the course of the investigation, In addition to the testimonies and confessions, the NKVD confiscated various firearms, texts on terror tactics, substantial Soviet and foreign currency, gold, as well as counter-revolutionary literature. These arrests, in turn, led to the uncovering of a cell in Gorky of 54 people, mostly organized in prison, whose goal, among others, was to organize prison escapes and border crossings for Kamenev and Zinoviev. By January of 1936, these arrests led to a small but well-connected group of Trotskyites in Moscow. Stalin had almost certainly lost faith in Yagoda at this point. The NKVD boss had allowed intentionally, unintentionally, or through neglect all of this to occur virtually unimpeded. The investigation of the Kremlin plot, with the library personnel in summer 1935, had been led by deputy of the NKVD, Yezhov. So, despite the fact that Yezhov was one of the figures who signed the opposition statement during the 1927 Congress, Stalin began to specifically ask for Yezhov to follow up on items he felt needed summary or investigation to present to the Politburo. Finally, the director of the Gorky Pedagogical Institute, Ivan Fedotov, implicated in the Gorky prison conspiracy, explained his connection with Valentin Olberg, whom he had met in August of 1935. According to Fedotov's interrogation, on the 28th of February 1936, Olberg, of whom he had no prior knowledge, came to his office at the Institute and said, "Greetings from abroad. Aren't you expecting a letter from an old man?" Which was, of course, super secret code for, "I'm a Trotskyite stooge." Olberg had sent his brother Pavel to Gorky at the end of 1934 so that, in the event Valentin was confronted regarding his movements, he could claim he was visiting his brother. We need to take a moment to breathe here because this is the point at which everything shifts. Certainly there was an uptick in the Soviets uncovering and subsequently arresting conspirators, but the impact of this began to be felt by the people. And it was generally understood as a good thing among the more sympathetic elements of the population, mostly peasants and frontline workers. But the uncovering of the group at the university in Kiev, followed by those at the Gorky Pedagogical Institute, and then an industrial university at which Fedotov took his internship, then at the Arzamas Soviet Party School, and so on, meant closer inspections of a large number of university faculty was necessary. And these inspections led to dismissals and occasionally further arrests. The intelligentsia of the USSR began to panic, and many students became disillusioned as well. These kids, young adults, they didn't understand the long legacy of the opposition, and so some of them reacted in ways which seemed rational to them, with disbelief and resentment. Additionally, older revolutionaries who had been politically inactive in recent years watched as some of their greatest heroes and old comrades, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, go down, and responded in the same way. The dissatisfaction hung like a dark cloud over huge segments of the population for years. We will discuss the contradiction we believe is embodied here in the conclusion episode. For now, let's get back to this damn conspiracy. Speaking of insurgents among the intelligentsia, Valentin Olberg got a job teaching Western history, of which he knew a decent amount, at the Pedagogical Institute in Gorky. Perhaps more importantly, Fedotov believed Olberg got his name from someone in Berlin. From November 1933 to January 1934, Fedotov had worked in the party committee of an automobile plant where he met a German by the name of Muller, who had been expelled from the KPD for being a Trotskyite. Muller told Fedotov that he had been sent to the USSR to agitate against the party. Muller claimed that the leadership of the Trotskyite movement in Berlin had come to the conclusion that eliminating the leadership of the USSR could only be achieved through assassination and terrorist struggle. Muller told Fedotov that the directive had come directly from Trotsky. When asked if Muller had heard this from Trotsky directly, Fedotov said, no. This no was a big one. Fedotov told Muller about the Trotsky cell in Gorky, who in turn told Trotsky's son Sedov when he left the USSR in early 1934, who then directed Olberg to go to Gorky. Fedotov told Olberg about the recent arrests of individuals connected to Gorky prison who chided him, saying, "You shouldn't have been confused after Nikolaev's shot. I will help you, but you also need to be more active. Trotsky believes that our people in the USSR are doing a lot of propaganda for the cause, but that this does not decide the outcome of the party. The main and most important thing is to thoroughly organize and carry out the murder of Stalin. This will be the alarm that will raise the masses to resolve all other issues and allow us to concretely resolve the issue of Trotsky's return to the leadership of the country. This can only be completed successfully if small, disconnected fighting squads are formed. These squads must recruit people who have not been compromised in the past by their affiliation with Trotskyists and who are embittered against the Soviet government." The archives have either been purged of the investigation materials from the first 2 months of Olberg's arrest, or they have not been released yet, as some of the referenced interrogation records are not present. Regardless, the first document available, dated March 8, references several previous interrogations which we do not have. But it is an important one in its own right. After the interrogator catches Olberg in a lie and references back to a previous admission, Olberg admits that Sedov had told him that there was a center of Trotskyites and Zinovievites who had formed a bloc in the USSR, which included Smirnov, Kavtaradze, Smilga, and Mrachovsky. The interrogator points out that these men are all Trotskyites. He asks Olberg if there was a bloc with Zinovievites, who were the members. Olberg then drops the names of Kamenev and Bakayev. This answer opened the door for the interrogator, who performs a top 10 anime death scene by asking the purpose of the bloc. And when that is explained, he asks how a bloc could be established considering the social strata of the USSR. Olberg replies, "I will answer specifically. Sedov, for example, told me, if there is a son of a kulak who will honestly fight under the banner of Trotskyism, he can and should be recruited for work. He also told me that in the conditions of a national republic, for example, Ukraine, one can rely on nationalist elements while pointing out that nationalist shades will not play a leading role, since the organization sets its main task to overthrow the current leadership of the party." Sedov also claimed that not every person who served the whites in 1918 to 1919 is a white guard today. Lenin once said that the working class must go with the entire peasantry against the landowners and capitalists. Now the time has come when the Bolshevik Leninists are obliged to go with the entire dissatisfied population against Bonapartism and the usurper dictatorship. This was forwarded to Stalin by Yezhov, which began the process which would necessitate the August trial. With Olberg testifying to direct connection with Sedov about the plans of terrorism as well as the establishment of the bloc, the individual cells could no longer claim ignorance of the tactics of the others. The next big reveal came during the interrogation of A.G. Kolodin, who had been expelled from the party in 1928 for Trotskyite shit, served exile for 1 year, came back, was able to rejoin the party and to study at university in Moscow, was expelled from the party again in 1933 for Trotskyite agitation, finished university, and became a senior inspector of the grain distribution department of the USSR. In one of his investigations, Kolodin stated that one of the 9 people he had known as a Trotskyite was G.F. Dmitriev, who was a teacher at the Military Transport Academy. Kolodin went on to say that he had pushed Dmitriev, arguing the need for an armed uprising on the outskirts of the USSR or in industrial centers. Dmitriev disagreed with Kolodin, contending that they should establish cadres within the Red Army before they could consider uprisings. When Kolodin asked if he felt like that was possible, Dmitriev replied that he and Kolodin had like-minded allies in the military academy, that their beliefs were a sort of political barometer. An earlier testimony implicated an insurgent group in Tomsk, Siberia, which in turn implicated a group in Novosibirsk. In Novosibirsk, still serving his sentence from 1927, was one Nikolai Muralov, whom we mentioned in the Part 2 narrative. He was the Moscow military garrison leader, close to Trotsky, and led the Moscow group during the failed anniversary putsch. Muralov was one of the very few Trots from that group who didn't capitulate. It turns out this was fully intentional. Muralov was to be the ideological leader and organizer for all the Trotskyite formations in western Siberia, which is where most of the exiled Trots would end up. He was working on organizing a political hunger strike at the point at which he was arrested. When officials searched his home, they discovered an archive of letters to Muralov from Trotsky's Alma Ata days, extensive correspondence with numerous Trotskyite exiles up to 1935, an archive of Trotsky's literature, and an illegal Browning revolver. The next break was an interrogation of Olberg's wife, Betty Augusta Frida Otovna. For one, after being confronted with contradictions in her testimony, she named Kurt Landau a number of times, bringing him to the NKVD's attention for the first time. But something more important followed. When asked about who in Berlin knew of Olberg's trip to the USSR, Betty named her parents, along with a number of other people, including Muller, Landau, and Kurt Robel. She also mentioned offhand that there was a delay which kept Olberg from leaving in December 1932, which forced him to leave March of 1933. Why? Trouble in getting a fake passport. March 15th. Smirnov's ex-wife, Alexandra Sadanova, was interrogated. Rykov and Bukharin were implicated in a discussion about the establishment of a bloc at the end of 1930 and into 1931. On March 21st, after a series of questions regarding the names of hidden Trotskyites, she dropped the name of Goltzman. Sadanova claimed she had no idea whether he was actually a hidden conspirator, but that he and Smirnov had kept closely connected, and so she suspected as much. Goltzman, along with Olberg, further connected the conspiracy with Trotsky through Sedov, though this wouldn't be exposed until closer to the trial date. On March 25th, 1936, Yagoda sent Stalin a top-secret summary of the main defendants, as the NKVD saw them at that point, ones they felt they could prove conclusively were guilty. Notably, this list still does not include Zinoviev, nor notable others who were connected. Clearly, the NKVD didn't feel they had enough evidence to convict them, or Yagoda was protecting them. Either way, the suggestion from Yagoda was, based on the materials of the investigation, in order to defeat the Trotskyist cadres, I consider it necessary. 1. All Trotskyists who are in exile and are actively working should be arrested and sent to distant camps, Kolyma, Ukhta. 2. Trotskyists who were expelled from the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks during the last check of party documents should be removed and, by decision of the Special Conference of the NKVD, sent to distant camps for a period of 5 years. 3. To suppress the terrorist activities of Trotskyists convicted of involvement in terrorism upon completion of the investigation, to try them in the military collegium of the Supreme Court, and applying to them the law of December 1st, 1934, to shoot them all. Vyshinsky, as presiding judge, agreed, but advised caution. He said that if a direct link to terrorism was established, that execution should be sought, but that each individual case needed prior approval from the Central Committee. We should also note that from the extensive collection of investigation materials at our disposal, it seems as though, while cooperative, Yagoda was in a hurry to finish the investigation and pin the entire connection to Trotsky on Smirnov. Regardless, on April 10th, in a follow-up investigation based on testimony regarding a terrorist attack planned for May Day in Gorky, a list of recovered materials was sent to Stalin containing firearms, ammunition, bomb-making components, and Trotskyite literature. According to the confessions of those arrested, the plan had been, simultaneously at the Lenin Mausoleum in Moscow and at Soviet Square in Gorky, to throw bombs at the column of demonstrators. There was also a plan to install a machine gun on the roof of the massive shopping mall across from the mausoleum in order to fire at attendees. This last plan was scrapped as it was unrealistic. In late April, during an interrogation, Mikhail Bukovsky mentions a Katsgal Gurovich who claimed responsibility for organizing Trotskyists within the Red Army. As Bukovsky was drafted, Gurovich relayed to him that there were a number of individuals throughout the military who were Trotskyist-minded. Bukovsky is pressed on the names of these people, but continues to claim throughout the interrogation that he did not know any of the specifics. This would begin a very long investigation, resulting in another trial in 1937, the details of which are forthcoming. On April 28, 1936, Eduard Goltzman was arrested. A co-signer of the opposition platform in 1927, he was now working as head of a theatrical costume rental warehouse. You yourself may find it difficult to imagine how a costume warehouse guy might become central to a conspiracy of this magnitude, but the Soviet government had no idea. The last major break in the case arrived on the 8th of May, as Valentin Olberg's brother Pavel revealed the truth of where Olberg obtained his fake Honduran passport. During previous testimony, Pavel mentioned that Valentin had moved to Prague, fearing repression from the newly ascendant Nazi government. When asked where his sister-in-law, another member of the conspiracy, lived at this time, Pavel mentioned that she was a German citizen and had moved back to Berlin. But since the NKVD knew that the man's brother was still living in Berlin during and after this time, Pavel was caught in a lie, and eventually admitted Valentin's connection with the Gestapo. The counterfeit passport in question had been seized the day Valentin Olberg was arrested in early January 1936. But up to this point, all individuals involved in the conspiracy had carefully skated around Valentin's method of acquisition. According to Pavel, Prague-based Slavic studies professor Vladimir Tukolevsky slowly talked him into being a Gestapo agent as well, as Pavel was barely getting by as a tutor. On the Gestapo payroll, Pavel worked to identify immigrants in Prague returning to Germany, making around 5,000 Czech crowns. Pavel, knowing of his brother's struggle in getting to the USSR for more than a few months at a time, suggested that Tukolevsky might be able to help. After the three met together, Tukolevsky offered to pay for Valentin's passport, but Olberg rebuffed him, wanting to use the 13,000 Czech crowns which Lev Sedov had given him instead. Perhaps Olberg did not wish to be indebted to a Gestapo agent, or rather, he did not want to be further indebted to a Gestapo agent. Regardless, Pavel already owed Tukolevsky some favors, and once in the USSR, he contacted the German embassy in Moscow and, through code, a Dr. Hensel. We believe this could be Nazi party member and later counselor with the Reich Aviation Ministry, Dr. Friedrich Hensel, but have been unable to verify at this point. Pavel went on to name Kurt Robel as a fellow Gestapo stooge, but stated that they did not meet. Robel feared he was being followed and fled back to Germany. And so, finally, after 8 months of investigation, Yagoda sent the draft resolution on June 19, 1936, to General Secretary Stalin, which aimed to bring before the Supreme Court 46 people connected to and with the most vital roles within the conspiracy. 23 people to bring before the Military College of the Supreme Court in Leningrad, and 13 people to bring before the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court in Kiev. Thus, the unraveling began.
The Zinoviev Kamenev trial, or the case of the Trotskyite Zinovievite Terrorist Center. Before we get into the trial proceedings, which will focus more on the public reactions and movements, we'd like to discuss a few things about the Soviet criminal investigation process. Outside of the dedicated, active, some might even say permanent, revolution, which was taking place during the Stalin eras of the USSR, it might be difficult to understand. Hell, it was difficult for a lot of anti- or passive communists to understand during this time. But the entire system was built and maintained by the party for communists, and thus, as the party saw it, for the workers in general. This created an antagonism which we will discuss in depth in the conclusions episode. The idea that Stalin simply pointed at people who were then arrested and forced to confess, if this was ever plausible, is now rendered demonstrably false. Again, thanks to this massive release of documents. CC members could not be arrested without permission from Stalin, which Stalin did not hand out lightly. Which meant that before these people were even arrested, a considerable amount of corroborating evidence and testimony had to be established and followed up on first. For example, Radek is first mentioned in regards to the conspiracy to assassinate members of the Politburo in early 1935, but wasn't arrested until after the Zinoviev-Kamenev trial in summer 1936. In fact, the day before the trial began, Stalin sent a letter to Yezhov and Kaganovich stating that the question of Radek's arrest should be dropped for the time being. The same is true for Bukharin. Putna, a prominent member of the military conspiracy, was mentioned in May of 1935 as involved in this conspiracy, but was not even demoted until early 1937. If anything, it could easily be claimed, based on this evidence, that rather than being overzealous and paranoid, the Soviet government was too slow and too cautious. Another factor of Soviet political life which must be understood is that for dedicated revolutionaries, removal from the apparatus which allowed them to engage in the ongoing revolution was a fate worse than death for most of them. This is proven over and over from the diaries and letters not only of prominent Soviet revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries like Zinoviev and Bukharin, but also from the diaries of run-of-the-mill party members who were arrested or feared arrest for political reasons. This is why the NKVD didn't need to torture prisoners to get information. Isolation from the world at large, and worse, isolation from political engagement, was torture enough for dedicated communists. This is why those arrested would plead and appeal and deny and lie until they were convinced that no one would believe them. If they were going to be isolated upon release anyway, they might as well admit and be granted death, or at the very least, to be seen as honest upon release. This connects directly to the third consideration, which is that, particularly for those who were ideological leaders or theoreticians, once they felt as though there was no way to prove their innocence, it was more important to be honest and to die honest than to lie and to be proven a liar in court, thus judged a liar by comrades and enemies alike. Communists also value a foundation of self-criticism. With enough time outside their particular echo chamber, they often saw things differently anyway. This is why, among concerns for the political future of their family, so many went to the firing squad, renouncing their past. These factors, particularly the third one, we believe, are the primary reasons why there was no physical evidence shown in court, in spite of physical evidence being collected. These trials were not for the West. They weren't even for apolitical Soviet citizens. These trials were for the dedicated party members who the leadership knew or believed were all that mattered for the future development of socialism. Furthermore, publicizing physical evidence would run the risk of showing other conspirators their hand. Those who had not yet been captured or discovered would know precisely what material items the government possessed, which would render their revelations moot. To be clear, physical evidence was used during interrogations. It was shown to the accused in order to provide evidence against the lies told in an attempt to draw out confessions. But apart from that, it should be noted that even in that bastion of liberty and constitutional rights, the United States of America, treason trials are done exclusively behind doors. Further, all that was needed to convict someone of treason in the United States in 1936 was 2 credible witnesses or a confession. And even today, if an arrestee admits guilt, no evidence is needed or even presented in court. The claims from Western press and the so-called leftists today, even before the release of these documents, is completely ridiculous. The Soviet Supreme Court had confessions, material evidence, circumstantial evidence, and what we will call theoretical evidence, through the supposedly materialist way in which the conspirators justified the motive for their seditious actions. The Kamenev-Zinoviev trial opened on the morning of August 19, 1936. Radek had been slated to be the prosecutor, but since he had been named in a number of the interrogation transcripts and statements related to the case, the Politburo voted to remove him and place Ulrich as prosecutor with Vyshinsky as deputy prosecutor. In spite of not knowing any of the accusations which had been leveled at him, Radek began to panic at his removal. He immediately sent a letter to Stalin denying any charges made against him, again, without knowing what they were, and gave a very convenient speech to the staff of Izvestia, where he worked, condemning the accused and the at-large opposition to which he supposedly no longer belonged. Notably, and perhaps without knowing of Radek's removal, Rykov also sent a letter to the Politburo asking to be placed as prosecutor for the trial.
I ask your permission to make this statement at the trial not for any personal interests, but solely because it seems to me it can be useful for the party. I am entirely and completely with the party and its leadership.
He went on to say, twice in 2 paragraphs, that all the conspirators needed to be shot. His request to replace Radek was, of course, refused by the Politburo. A note written on the document by an unknown member of the Politburo reads,
In view of the fact that both during the investigation and at the end of the trial, several defendants mentioned their connections with the right deviationists, including Comrade Rykov, it is considered inappropriate for Comrade Rykov to act as a public prosecutor.
The defense refused counsel, did not call for witnesses, or attach materials. Kamenev moved to ask that one of the witnesses, Yakovlev, be interrogated after him, which was granted by Vyshinsky and Ulrich. The primary defendants, Kamenev and Zinoviev, were joined by their accused co-conspirators. Day 1 of the trial was extensive, but in general, the defendants admitted to various crimes, including plots to assassinate Stalin and other high-ranking Soviet officials. It also highlighted the alleged connections between defendants, foreign agents, and the Gestapo. All of the defendants were given the opportunity to speak and cross-examine other defendants and witnesses. The foreign press, despite the efforts of some editors back home, sent sympathetic summaries to their respective home offices. According to NKVD records, there was a tendency to exaggerate the testimony of those working in the Red Army. Reingold's testimony gave a general impression that the plot was not fully uncovered. Again, according to the NKVD, there was an emphasis on the demoralization of Zinoviev and the grotesqueness of Kamenev. It was even noted.
There are no attempts, as usual in the past, to cast a shadow over the process by depicting it as a dramatization. On the contrary, the testimony is conveyed in a completely serious tone, along with a number of details and descriptions of the external situation. German correspondents are trying to use the testimony to portray the situation in the party and the Red Army as gloomy. The mention of the Gestapo was conveyed, for now, in a calm tone. Notably, the Japanese correspondents sent nothing back after day one. Day two brought essentially more of the same, fleshing out the minutiae of the conspiracy. Gilles, the French correspondent for Agence France-Presse, hinted at the trial being staged, but everyone else remained convinced that it was genuine. Demery Bress, of the Christian Science Monitor, was overheard by the NKVD saying, "Of course it's natural to expect the death penalty, but since logic here is not European but Asian, then anything is possible." Yeesh. The French correspondents, the report states, were the most secretive. They are interested in the trial, in their words, as material for studying Trotskyism, whose activity in France is attracting attention, and whose activity should increase in connection with the formation of Doriot's party, with which the Trotskyists will automatically be forced to come into contact. Jacques Doriot was a former French Communist Party member, expelled, oddly, for his support of a united front against fascism. He and Trotsky were both members until Trotsky's expulsion in 1929. Doriot went on to form the French Popular Party, which was itself a fascist party, collaborating with Nazi Germany during the war. The German correspondents downplayed the Gestapo role, pretending that it wasn't a serious claim. The word choice of the NKVD agent here lends credence to the idea that the high-ranking Soviet leaders did not fabricate claims. Again, the Japanese did not send any reports on day two. In fact, they did not attend the trial. On the 21st, Tomsky appeared before a closed session of the CC to defend himself against accusations made during the trial itself. Radek wrote an article, "The Trotskyist Zinoviev Fascist Gang and its Hetman Trotsky." The same day, Rakovsky wrote another entitled, "There Should Be No Mercy." The third day of the trial brought a bit more depth to the foreign correspondent's perception of the cast of characters. According to a top-secret NKVD report on the matter, Smirnov impressed them with his smarmy retorts. They lauded Kamenev's appearance and manners. More confusion begins to show in remarks about the self-flagellation of the accused. As is the usual interpretation in so-called democratic judicial practice, the report goes on to say, there were remarks made about the procedural side too, different from the one adopted in Europe. Factual data about the accused, their biography, place of residence are not disclosed, there is no documentation, etc. According to Gilles Habas, who spoke frankly on this topic, the trial will weaken the prestige of the Comintern and increase sympathy for Trotsky among the non-proletarian strata of the West. In one of their telegrams, the Germans noted with satisfaction that the connections of the accused with the Gestapo were not emphasized, but were mentioned only in passing. The articles by Radek, Piatakov, and Rakovsky were met with interest and caused some sensation, but the impression was ultimately negative. The sincerity of the authors was questioned, since two of them were compromised in the testimony of the accused just the day before. Again, the Japanese correspondent did not show. On the morning of August 22nd, the final day of the trial, Tomsky died by suicide. The day prior, in a closed CC meeting, he had admitted to actions and knowledge of actions which he likely knew would lead to his undoing. Sentences were handed down.
With this trial concluded, the cloud of another to come was already passing over the Union, enveloping a multitude with its shadow. The first trial had uncovered new names and evidence up to the day proceedings began, and so this was inevitable. And outside the Union, the international situation was beginning to ramp up to the inevitable war with fascism. Secret discussions had begun between the Czech president, Menace, and Hitler in an attempt to create a non-aggression pact in the event of war. The USSR sent notice to Norway, where Trosky was staying. As a result of facts exposed during the trial, the USSR requested of Norway that if they were interested in ongoing relations with the USSR, that they would no longer grant asylum to Trosky. In December, Norway would expel Trosky from their country. President Lázaro Cárdenas granted him asylum in Mexico, and he moved to Mexico City, where he lived in the house of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. The walls were closing in on the old man. It would be 4 short years before the consequences of his actions caught up with him. But we'll get to that in another section. At the conclusion of the Zinoviev-Kamenev trial, the remnants of the conspiracy were scattered and terrified. The executions led them to the inevitable conclusion that if they came clean, they would be dealt with similarly. And if they stayed hidden, they risked being named by any number of people still being interrogated. The only way out was to up the stakes and adapt. The new strategy, according to one interrogation after the trial, was relayed as such.
The interests of secrecy require the creation of quantitatively small combat groups. These groups had to be deeply conspiratorial and built within themselves according to the chain principle, in which each member of the group knows only the person directly connected with him due to the circumstances of combat work. It was clear the urgent need to deeply conspiratorialize the members of the center, minimize personal meetings between them, and eliminate the practice of simultaneous meetings and meetings of the center's members.
On August 31st, military attaché in London, Putna, was brought in. We don't have access to the request for arrest nor the list of materials seized during the arrest because they have not been declassified or because they were purged. Either way, according to the materials of the investigation, Putna was accused of membership in the Trotskyite Zinovievite organization. Notably, Putna, a military general, confessed on the first day. In this confession, Putna admits to being an active member of the military group of this organization. This is the first mention, of which we are aware, pertaining to a specific military conspiracy. Putna was friends with Smirnov, with whom he fought in the Fifth Army during the so-called Civil War. Putna had also signed the Statement of the 83 in 1927 at the Party Congress in support of the opposition. In the summer of that year, a meeting between Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Smirnov, Pyatakov, Rakovsky, Radek, Muralov, Bakayev, and Putna took place to hammer out the goal of the opposition following their defeat at the Congress. According to Putna, not much was established at that point, but at the end of the meeting, they decided that there would be a development of a military platform, which would be entrusted to Muralov, Primakov, and Putna. In 1931, in a meeting with Sedov and Smirnov in Berlin, Muralov's role was taken over by Dreitzer. This decision was likely made as a result of Muralov's exile and special position as one of the few who hadn't capitulated. It further placed him in a prime spot to agitate and coordinate among political prisoners. Again, according to Putna's first interrogation, the goal of the group was to take a defeatist position in the event of war, which most at this stage had taken as an inevitability. Then, after a series of embarrassing defeats, the group would remove Voroshilov by force and take control of the army, then the government. This changed in 1935 when a plan to assassinate Voroshilov was put into effect. We will come back to the further development of the military conspiracy in a later section. For now, it is enough to remember that there was already damning evidence of that conspiracy in September of 1936. That same month, another prominent military leader, Aiki, sent an encrypted report of the discovery and liquidation of a large Trotskyite group in Kemerovo, whose purpose was to sabotage defense construction, as well as the diversion of 90,000 rubles from the government funds to benefit arrested Trotskyites and their families. Notably, Aiki was a member of the military conspiracy, though he was not suspected at this time. A major break in the case occurred when Pyatakov's secretary implicated him for the actions which he had denied up to this point. Pyatakov still denied the charges, but let slip that he held a meeting with Sokolnikov in the summer of 1935 in the office of the Commissariat of Heavy Industry. On the 17th of September, Vyshinsky terminated investigation procedures on Bukharin and Rykov due to the lack of court testimony drawing a direct line to them. For example, Reingold, while claiming the two were involved, never admitted to personally speaking with them about the block, and Kamenev, who also named them, never admitted clearly to negotiating with them either, instead going through Tomsky. Probably the most significant occurrence during the trial was a proposal from Stalin and Zhadanov to remove Yagoda as head of the NKVD and appoint Yezhov in his place. This same proposal, which was made to the Politburo, included an additional suggestion to remove Rykov as well. Despite insufficient evidence to warrant an investigation at this time, there was still too much evidence to allow him to remain as People's Commissariat of Communications at such a crucial time. Sokolnikov, still in custody, made interesting confessions in early October of 1936. He claimed that in 1934 he met the publisher of the British-Russian Gazette, Stafford Talbot, whom he knew from his previous position as plenipotentiary representative in London. They met with the intention and by the direction of the Trotskyite Zinovievite leadership to establish connections to the British and French government. Knowing Talbot had those connections, Sokolnikov told him that the current Soviet government was not mature enough for the volume of socialist measures being undertaken, that he and his comrades considered it necessary to give foreign capital the opportunity to participate in the economy in order to give it the necessary boost to maintain socialist measures. Talbot, in turn, agreed to help him establish contact with conservative politician and soon-to-be Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, and conservative politician and soon-to-be Secretary to Winston Churchill, Robert Boothby. It is important to note that in the investigation, Sokolnikov mentions that one of his follow-up meetings never happened, as Talbot did not visit the USSR again. A follow-up investigation found that the NKVD had denied Talbot entry at the time on the grounds that he was an established British intelligence officer engaged in espionage activities on the territory of the Union. While all of this was being uncovered, a case against the saboteurs of a West Siberian mine, Kemerovo, was put together and scheduled for November 19th. Vyshinsky and Yezhov wrote the draft indictment with the intention to conduct the trial with open doors, calling witnesses and bringing in experts to verify the claims of the confessions and statements. In other words, to cater to the Western press's claims of Soviet trials being staged. Of course, they would claim as much anyway, so it was likely a moot point. One of the people indicted was a German citizen, Emil Stickling. The indictment explicitly stated that all who were sentenced would be executed. This caused a lot of anxiety and became fodder for anti-Soviet propaganda for the Nazi government. Stickling was sentenced to death, but the German government negotiated this down to 10 years in prison. With the turning of the new year, 1937 was ushered in with a draft indictment of a case against Pyatakov, Radek, Sokolnikov, Muralov, and 13 others. This indictment was essentially an extension of the first trial. While the first set its sights on the so-called Parallel Center, whose purpose was to seize power with the help of foreign states, this trial targeted what was called the Reverse Center. This group, the prosecution argued, began receiving direction from Trotsky beginning in December of 1935 at the latest. Radek said of Trotsky's plot,
"It must be understood that without a certain equating of the social structure of the USSR with the capitalist powers, the government of the bloc will not be able to remain in power and maintain peace. Allowing German and Japanese capital to exploit the USSR will create large capitalist interests on Soviet territory. Those strata in the village that have not overcome their capitalist psychology and are dissatisfied with the collective farms will be drawn to us. The Germans and Japanese will demand that we will relieve the tension in the village, so we will have to make concessions and allow the dissolution of the collective farms or withdrawal from the collective farms. This means we must retreat. We must firmly understand this. How far and to what extent we must retreat to capitalism is difficult to say now. This can be specified after coming to power."
The Reverse Center's purpose would be to weaken Soviet power internally in order to ease the speed at which foreign powers would be able to bring it to the negotiating table in the event of war. With the initial draft mentioned Trotsky's indirect agreements with Hess specifically, Stalin edited it to say, "one of the leaders of the German Nazis." This was done with all named parties, likely in order not to provoke hostile governments who would inevitably use it in propaganda. While Pyatakov was the liaison for the German side of the center, Radek was in charge of negotiations with Imperial Japan. They promised to cede Ukraine to Germany and Primorye and the Amur region to Japan. On the topic of Japan, Trotsky's own accounting of further concessions was,
"We will have to cede Sakhalin oil to Japan and guarantee her oil supplies in the event of a war with America. We must also allow her to exploit gold. We will have to agree to Germany's demand not to oppose her in seizing the Danube countries and the Balkans, and not to interfere with Japan in seizing China."
The prosecution cited the results of the recent Centralnaya mine sabotage trial, that of a nitrogen fertilizer plant in Gorlovka, 2 chemical plants in Voskresensk and Nevsky as evidence connected to this trial. This included a number of technical examinations to prove intentional sabotage, which resulted in the deaths of numerous citizens, as well as crucial material damage, which the Union would need in the event of war. 10 children were killed while pretending to be miners because dynamite had been cached by the saboteurs in a playground. Railway sabotage was also added to the indictment. A military train crash at Shumika Station in October of 1935, which cost the lives of 29 Red Army soldiers, along with 2 other crashes in December of the same year and February of 1936. These also included detailed technical reports to prove internal sabotage. In this trial, the Soviet prosecution decided to pander to the West a bit more, being sure to include physical evidence. Unit 731 member and Japanese intelligence officer Mr. X, who we now know to be Hiroshi Oshima, wrote a series of letters and sent photographs to some of the saboteurs, which were included. A further note, Hiroshi Oshima was implicated in evidence at the Nuremberg trials for plotting the assassination of Joseph Stalin with Russian agents sympathetic to his cause. In 1939, he spoke with Himmler about how their mutual intelligence actions would hopefully end with the disintegration of the USSR. Regardless, the names of several German firms were dropped as points of contact for both the Nazis and the conspirators. Among others were Linde, who provided oxygen and helium for the Nazi rocket program, as well as equipment for concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Borzig, a munitions supplier. Demag, a major financial contributor to Hitler's campaign, a tank factory owner, as well as a textile factory owner, a factory at which slave labor was used extensively. Also of note at this time, the massive Hearst press machine, owner of 19 major U.S. newspapers spanning every major city, including 2 in New York, signed a contract with the Nazi government, who agreed to pay them $400,000 a year to be their international mouthpiece. Hearst didn't disappoint, carefully crafting the narrative surrounding the USSR, which many still parrot to this day. Let us break for a moment to take the pulse of the Soviet population in early 1937. The average worker, while sympathetic to socialism, was largely nonplussed by the trials and purges. 36-year-old accountant for his kolkhoz, Konstantin Fedorovich, who had seen the worst of the drought and sabotage during the collectivization process, was in a good place.
Today is the new year, 1937. Happy new Soviet year! 1937 is the 20th year of the Socialist Revolution. This is my first day to start work on the all-union census. Now I will be busy with this until January 7th. Today I feel cheerful, healthy, and in a very good mood.
David Samuelov, the emo kid we met at the beginning of the last episode, now 16 years old, isn't feeling as melancholy this year.
Exactly a year ago, I wrote something that seemed very stupid. However, that whole year, if I summed it up, was no less stupid. That year, I did nothing but nasty things. 1936 was significant for me in many ways. Yes, I grew up and became better. Perhaps I did not become an adult, but there is something unshakable inside, independent of frequent changes. And how much I have read. Yesterday, I celebrated the new year in a completely different way. Thoughts about last night fill me with joy. Friends, we gathered. There were only a few of us. The candles on the tree were burning. Everyone was happy and drinking champagne. Midnight struck. I was a little drunk. Volkov was sitting next to me. I kissed him. Then we shook hands and I wrote a letter to Natasha, something incoherent but tender. Then we became sad. It was dark in one of the rooms. I sat by the window and thought about how I loved everyone. And I wanted to cry.
The intelligentsia, the creators of art, the politicians, and the bosses, they had a very different outlook at this time. They were terrified, angry, bitter, all of which was directed either at the entire Bolshevik government or, more commonly, Stalin himself. Physician, anthropologist, and eventual specialist in biomechanics, Lev Nikonalev was among those not feeling as though life has gotten better.
The neighborhood domestic worker drank 2 glasses of vodka to celebrate the holiday. She suffered from acute alcohol poisoning. She lost consciousness, screamed wildly, and rolled on the floor. They put her in the hallway near my door, 4 or 5 steps from the bed I was lying on. The neighbors, you see, find it inconvenient to put her in their room since they live in cramped quarters. They don't call an ambulance because they don't want to pay 25 rubles. All this is happening in an apartment belonging to scientists. I don't think that anywhere in the world is a professor forced to live in such conditions. I occupy 2 rooms in an overcrowded apartment. 6 people, including 2 children, live in these 2 rooms. I cannot be alone for a minute. It is impossible to study or work under such conditions. I have petitioned the scientific section many times to be given at least a 3-room apartment. I have always been refused. I have asked to be given an extra room in the apartment I live in. Every time a refusal.
Alexander Arasov was the man who ordered the shelling of the Kremlin at the age of 27. 20 years later, he had grown very tired. As head of the Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, or VOKS, V-O-K-S, he was in charge of organizing social visits to the USSR or visits from Soviet representatives to other countries. He just wanted to write. But in a misappropriation of funds scandal related to one of his trips, he had begun to raise eyebrows in the desperate times of the late 1930s.
I feel like I'm in a mousetrap. There is little trust. Little attention is paid to my work at Vox. At work, petty people without a brain and without morals diligently do their dirty work. In the family, the children, Lena and Olya, as recently revealed, are capable of lying very badly and do not have simple family relations with me. Natasha, the eldest daughter, never even visits me, does not call, does not write, like a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. After the article in Pravda, despite the response published there, the attitude towards me and many comrades became extremely reversed. This is what we need to do in this case. My wife and I discussed. It is clear that all this cannot be left as is. Bureaucrats, schemers, my own daughters, and family circumstances seem to be pushing me out of life and towards the grave with their combined efforts. I will make one last attempt and send a letter to the Politburo.
We mention these stories not as a way to virtue signal or to demonize the Bolsheviks during an otherwise incredibly inspiring historical epoch. Neither are we trying to play both sides. We only want you to remember that revolution is not a dinner party. Or perhaps a revolution isn't made with lavender oil, or any number of other inadequate phrases. Whether or not these people were guilty of the crimes of which they were accused, whether or not this was a necessary tragedy, people were hurt. Human beings saw their lives torn away from them, their freedom taken. Many others, innocent or not, felt that pain. As socialists, we must be aware of the difficult decisions to be made in the face of inevitable crises. But we should never let that crush our sense of empathy. We should never forget that even our enemies are human. With that said, let us move on to 2 of the darkest years in the history of a shining beacon.
The Pyatakov-Radek Trial, or the case of the anti-Soviet Trotskyist Center. The lead-up to the trial was marred by a mess of diplomatic issues related to the impending war. The position of the USSR in the view of the world was paramount. All of the Soviet diplomats from England to the US to Sweden were working hard to secure some sort of support or guarantee in the event of a Nazi attack, or, preferably, to push them back before that happened. The stakes couldn't be higher. The upcoming trial was especially contentious because of the link, directly, between Nazi Germany and terrorist acts on Soviet soil. Foreign Affairs Chief Litvinov was deeply concerned about this. The Soviet government allowed the mention of Nazi Germany's connection to such acts, specifically receipt from a Nazi agent of a bomb by a member of the terrorist organization. The Soviet government would have to respond loudly and vocally in protest. Wars had been started for less. In this case, Litvinov suggested that testimony related to this incident be given behind closed doors. Further, that Germans only be executed if absolutely necessary. The Union couldn't afford to provoke the Nazis. Not yet. So they removed the naming of Japan and Germany specifically from the testimonies spoken in court, and they had the two incriminating testimonies behind closed doors. Before the trial began, Yagoda was officially removed from any position of authority with regards to judicial cases. The proceedings began on the morning of January 23, 1937. The trial itself went off without a hitch, aside from some perfunctory protests, particularly from Japan. And of course, Trotsky and Sedov immediately began denying the things they were hearing. The Soviet government continued their due diligence even after those who had been sentenced were shot, scouring foreign newspapers for information which might shed light on the honesty of the testimonies. For example, an investigation done by a Norwegian reactionary paper, Tidenstein, or A Sign of the Times, found that while Trotsky was staying in Norway, Pyatakov had visited. Pyatakov explained his trip was for the purpose of, quote, getting acquainted with a local cooperative, end quote. During Pyatakov's time there, Trotsky spent 2 days with only his secretary in a remote country house by a small lake. What purpose in the midst of a terrible snowstorm would compel them to do so? The article makes several more confirmations that Pyatakov and Trotsky met. Another paper notes that Lake Eyangin in December 1935 was frozen over completely and would have been an ideal place for a German plane to land inconspicuously, refuting one of Trotsky's denials that such a thing would be impossible. In the end, of the 17 people indicted, Sokolnikov, Radek, Stroilov, and Arnold were given 8 to 10 years in prison. The remaining 13 were sentenced to death. With the documents which have very recently been declassified, we can now say with confidence that the defendants' statements were their own, that they were not forced to write anything, that they were not promised leniency or threatened with deaths or persecution of their families. They certainly hoped for leniency, hoped that their families would not be persecuted, but there was no delusion among them as to the likelihood of that. The closing statements of some of the defendants are incredibly powerful and fascinating. If we could cite them all without making an additional 5 episodes covering the trials, we would. But since we cannot, we will cite one section of Karl Radek's, who, at the time, was certain he would be executed. He understood everything clearly, finally, and he made a chilling plea that we wish had been listened to more clearly. Perhaps this was the reason that the citizen judges sentenced him to 10 years instead of death. He said, "I will return to the name Dreitzer a little." The state prosecutor said that we would return to this name, and I will return to it in one context which was not examined here. When Dreitzer did not appear in Moscow for 7 to 8 months, I could think that this was a conspiracy. But when Dreitzer had not appeared in January, having received an invitation from me to come to a meeting, came to Moscow, and did not appear, Then it became clear to me that Trotsky, on the basis of the correspondence he had with us, seeing Pyattakov's rebuff and our doubts about the defeatist line, was creating some new devilry on par with the parallel center. I see this as the fact that Dreitzer passed us in 1935. When I read the trial material about the United Center, there was not a single fact that I knew had been overlooked by others. This means that some third organization was operating here. And finally, when Pyattakov returned from abroad, he mentioned in passing about his conversation with Trotsky, that Trotsky had told him that a cadre of people who had not been corrupted by Stalin's leadership was being created. But when I read about Olberg and asked others whether anyone knew about Olberg's existence, no one knew about it, and it became clear to me that Trotsky was creating here, in addition to the cadres who had gone through his school, an organization of agents who had gone through the school of German fascism. Did I know before the arrest that it would end in arrest? How could I not know about it if the head of the organizational section of my bureau, Tivel, was arrested? If Fridolund, with whom I had met very often in recent years, was arrested? I will not name other names. I can name a dozen more people who often met with me. The answer is as follows. I was one of the leaders of the organization. I knew that Soviet justice was not a meat grinder, that there were people of varying degrees of guilt among us, that we, the leaders, had to answer with our heads for what we did. But that there was a significant layer of people whom we had brought to this path of struggle, who did not know the basic, I would say, guidelines of the organization, who were blindly trudging forward. If the question was raised here whether we were tormented during the investigation, then I must say that it was not me who was tormented, but I tormented the investigators, forcing them to do unnecessary work. For 2.5 months I forced the investigators by contrasting the testimonies of other defendants to me to reveal to me the whole picture, so that I could see who confessed, who did not confess, who revealed what. This went on for 2.5 months, and one day the head of the investigation came to me and said, "You are already the last one. Why are you wasting time and delaying, not saying what you can show?" And I said, "Yes, I will start giving you testimony tomorrow." And the testimony that I gave from the first to the last does not contain any corrections. And so, citizen judges, I will finish this last word with the following. We will answer to the full extent of Soviet law, believing that your sentence, whatever it will be, is fair. But we want to meet it as a conscious people. We know that we have no right to tell the masses that we are not their teachers. But we want to say 3 things to those elements who were connected with us. The first thing, the Trotskyist organization had become the center of all counter-revolutionary forces. The right-wing organization, which has contacted it, and was on the way to merging with it, is the same center of all counter-revolutionary forces in the country. The state power will cope with these terrorist organizations. We have no doubt about this, based on our own experience. But there is a half, a quarter, an eighth of all Trotskyists in the country, people who helped us without knowing about the terrorist organization, but sympathizing with us. People who, because of liberalism, because of the party's opposition, gave this help. We say to these people, when a shell ends up in a steel hammer, it is not so dangerous. But when a shell gets caught in a propeller, there may be an accident. We are in a period of great tension, in the pre-war period. To all these elements in the face of the court and in the face of reprisal, we say, whoever has the slightest crack in relation to the party, let him know that tomorrow he could be a saboteur. He could be a traitor, if this crack is not carefully repaired by frankness to the end before the party. Second, we must tell the Trotskyist elements in France, Spain, and other countries, and there are such. The experience of the Russian Revolution has shown that Trotskyism is a wrecker of the workers' movement. We must warn them that they will pay with their heads if they do not learn from our experience. And finally, we must say to the whole world, to all who fight for peace, Trotskyism is a weapon of the warmongers. We must say this with a firm voice, because we have learned this. We have suffered for this. It was incredibly hard for us to admit this, but this is a historical fact. And we will pay with our heads for the truth of this fact.
Yagoda's Secrets and Yezhov's Sacrifices. Content warning: suicide. As mentioned before, Mikhail Tomsky, a close comrade of the right faction of Bukharin and Rykov, died by suicide at the conclusion of the Trotskyite Zinovievite trial. He left behind several notes, one of which was addressed to Stalin directly, and in a postscript, Tomsky wrote, first, an apology for saying that the workers would kill Stalin back in 1928, followed by an ominous mention of who had set him on the path of opposition. Ask my wife personally. Only she will name them. A few weeks later, Yezhov sent a letter to Stalin, who was on vacation in Sochi. The Politburo had tasked Yezhov with informing Tomsky's family of the funeral arrangements, and to see if Tomsky's wife would give Yezhov the name of the figure mentioned in his suicide letter. She revealed a number of things to him. First, that Mikhail had spoken to her of suicide for a long time, the evening before he went through with it. He even wrote the letter in front of her. Second, that his close friend Borovsky was present on the morning of the suicide and, according to her, also knew what was about to happen. Neither of them tried to stop him. According to his wife, he calmly took a weapon, went for a walk alone that morning, and shot himself in the far corner of a park. Deputy to Yezhov, Georgy Molchanov, had already been to Tomsky's dacha in Bolshevo, just north of Moscow, after they heard of the suicide. Molchanov recovered the letter to Stalin and subsequently delivered it. But Tomsky's wife refused to give Molchanov the name of the person Tomsky referenced, stating that she would only give it to Stalin, but mentioned that it was not a member of the Politburo. But when Yezhov spoke with her, she said quite directly that Genrikh Yagoda, head of the NKVD, played an active role in leading the rightists and had been regularly supplying them with intelligence on the issues of the Central Committee. Yezhov went on to say that even before Tomskaya's revelation, after reading Tomsky's letter to Stalin, Yagoda suggested that Tomsky had likely named him motivated by a desire for revenge. Yezhov argued to the Central Committee that it was likely Tomsky wanted to give a, quote, counter-revolutionary kick from the grave, end quote. After following up in the files, Yezhov claimed that he found nothing concrete regarding Yagoda within them, but that there were signals about the existence of the bloc and terrorist work in 1933 and 1934, which went, quote, unnoticed. One of Stalin's closest friends, according to his bodyguard, was Sergo Orzhokenidze. Orzhokenidze also sent him a letter at this time. Sergo's worries were quite clear, that they needed to be very careful with the military probes, lest the wreckers begin naming anyone and everyone in order to destroy the military from within and the faith of the people from without. A prophecy, perhaps. There is no more communication on the Yagoda matter in the archives until January 25th, 1937, but the 26th of September 1936 was the last time that he sent any official NKVD reports. We aren't sure if the documents between those dates were purged, haven't been declassified, or were simply not archived to avoid anything getting back to Yagoda before he could be investigated. In late January 1937, Yezhov sent a report to Stalin detailing financial issues he had discovered, going through files and evidence to which he now had access as head of the NKVD. The report states that there was a secret fund kept by Yagoda and his deputy Bulanov, known only to the two of them, Molotov and Stalin. It consisted of money and treasures acquired via confiscation, discovery of caches, and from detained contraband. Yezhov suggested handing it over to the People's Commissariat of Finance, which was done, because of market fluctuations and the value of diamonds on the international market. The fund was valued at around $92 million, adjusted for inflation to December of 2024. The paper money portion of the fund was apparently formed back in 1930. No one knew how much was in it originally, but cash exited the fund regularly and was never replenished. According to Bulanov, 90% of the fund was spent on NKVD workers and their wives to go abroad for, quote, treatment. This was in addition to known funds, which were distributed by the government for the purpose of these trips. A couple of days later, Senior Major of State Security Alexeyev sent a report regarding a case in the early 1930s related to the Recruitment affair. At the time, Alexeyev was the head of the NKVD branch in Western Siberia. Alexeyev, apparently motivated by the removal of Yagoda, sent a report to Yezhov stating that, in the course of the Recruitment investigation, Alexeyev had uncovered evidence which suggested that the group had made plans to assassinate Stalin. Perhaps more importantly, the plot was led by Uglanov, who was arrested, released, and reinstated to the party at that time, along with Bukharin. We'll get to this when we discuss Bukharin in a special upcoming bonus episode. For this section, the key is that Yagoda, upon hearing of Alexeyev's discoveries related to the assassination plot at that time, in the early 1930s, immediately sent a cipher to the man telling him that the matter had been forwarded to the Central Committee and to immediately transfer all of the prisoners and confiscated documents to Moscow, despite them having just arrived at the prison in Siberia. Because only a few people involved in the conspiracy were sentenced, and because most of those who were had been released before their term ended, Alexeyev became suspicious. Further, after Uglanov was exposed again with Bukharin during the testimonies of the Reverse Center trial, Alexeyev was convinced that the matter had been covered up by Yagoda at the time. If the conspiracy hadn't been obscured in this way, he argued, the entire block could have been exposed in the early 30s before much of the damage was done. On February 20th, 1937, Yagoda, now head of the People's Commissariat of Communication, submitted his last official report before his arrest. It was a note regarding Rykov, who previously had the job, and the ways he had clearly used his position to intentionally sabotage the communication network of the USSR in order to sow confusion and chaos. Ironically, Yagoda would end up in the same proceedings as Rykov. Unrelated to him, but important to the narrative in general, on the 18th of February 1937, Sergo Orjonikidze shot himself in his apartment. According to Molotov, he killed himself because his brother had been recently arrested for anti-Soviet agitation, and Stalin had refused to order his release. We haven't found any evidence of this, although we now know that Khrushchev had 5 cases of files from this period destroyed, as well as Beria's entire archive, so we can't guarantee that this wasn't the case either. What we can say, with the materials available to us, is that Orjonikidze had received a series of letters over the years from prominent Georgian left deviationist Lomenadze, who formed a left-right coalition against collectivization in the early 1930s. These letters were presented to the Central Committee in December of 1936. They made clear that Ordzhonikidze had known about Lomenadze's views and had said nothing. Further, 2 weeks before his death, Ordzhonikidze had given an extremely angry and accusatory speech to the various leaders of the main departments of heavy industry, of which he was in charge. He got a lot of pushback from them, and the issues he brought up related to widespread sabotage did not diminish. In fact, multiple reports of sabotage continued to pour in over the following 2 weeks. Any of these factors, or any combination of them, might have led Ordzhonikidze to the decision to take his own life. As night approached, on the 23rd of February, 1937, the plenum of the Central Committee was called to order by Molotov, who turned the proceedings over to Yezhov. The NKVD chief relayed the latest findings of the organization regarding the accusations leveled against Bukharin and Rykov at the previous plenum, which had been interrupted and postponed at the request of Stalin in order to allow for further investigation. Over the course of the next 4 days, Bukharin and Rykov explained themselves in a back and forth with members of the Central Committee. As was generally the case in such settings, Stalin barely spoke. But as those proceedings closed, Stalin delivered a speech announcing the special commission of 36 CC members, chaired by Mikoyan, to decide how to deal with Bukharin and Rykov. The commission was split 4 ways. Some wanted to simply exclude them from CC membership. Others advised for a military tribunal with the possible outcome of execution. Still others, a trial with 10 years set as the maximum sentence. The final group wanted a trial with no maximum sentence set. This last proposal argued for bypassing Soviet courts and handing the cases over to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. It was this proposal which prevailed. A resolution reflecting the proposal was presented before the entire Central Committee, who adopted it without amendment, with unanimous consent, and with the abstentions of Bukharin and Rykov. Again, we will cover Bukharin in depth in a bonus episode in the future. The plenum continued for over a week with the discussion of elections, lessons learned, the number of wreckers convicted in each department, agriculture, and so on. But on the 2nd of March, Yagoda made a speech to the plenum attempting to take responsibility for the failures of the GPU/NKVD. He states he should have concentrated power better, that he shouldn't have trusted his deputy, which Stalin warned him of in 1935, that they should have followed up on Olberg when they received his letters to Sedov, that they should have investigated the industrial incidents and transport incidents as sabotage instead of accidents, but that he had learned his lessons and would implement corrections in his future work. But his realignment came too late. Things had already begun to unravel. That same morning, a telegram arrived in Moscow from the NKVD station in Leningrad, relaying the story of a prosecutor there who had shot himself in his apartment. According to the man's friend, who had spent the previous 3 nights with him, the prosecutor heard, incorrectly, that Yagoda, Rykov, and Bukharin had been arrested. That 2 top officials in Leningrad had also been arrested. The prosecutor had feared that he was next. 9 days later, Vyshinsky filed a report stating that, in a number of prisons, political prisoners were receiving benefits not granted them by the law. For example, some lived in the apartment of the warden, others were not locked out of any buildings and could go wherever they pleased, including to storage rooms, where they had access to confiscated passports, party cards, and so on. On the 29th of March, arrest and search warrants were issued and executed for Genrikh Yagoda. On April 2nd, he was interrogated for the first time. He was presented with extremely damning evidence, but was smarmy throughout, and pleaded ignorance to everything. Within the week, a report was delivered concerning the search of his belongings. This search included his apartment, storage rooms, his dacha in Ozerki, his office, and his personal possessions. Investigators found cash amounting to roughly $27,000 in today's money, over 1,000 bottles of wine, almost 4,000 pornographic images, 11 pornographic films, 19 revolvers, 12 hunting rifles, 2 combat rifles, 10 ancient daggers, antique and ancient coins, modern gold and silver coins, 3 grand pianos, a rubber dildo, as well as an incredible number of expensive coats, furs, boots, silks, carpets, tobacco, foreign records, cameras, and on and on. Trust us, the full list would take all day to read. Lastly, though, 542 pieces of Trotskyite and fascist literature were found among these items. The 26th of April is the next interrogation protocol available, although it is clear from the notes and transcript that there were others in between. In it, Yagoda opens up, stating that his introduction to the conspiracy began with friendships formed with Rykov, Bukharin, Tomsky, and Uglanov, forming a core of high-ranking rightists. He goes on to say that in 1928, they had a meeting in which it was decided that, since he was already deputy of the GPU, he would distance himself from the rest of the group and pretend staunch support for the party. In the event of an exposure of the right faction, Yagoda promised to attempt to direct attention toward the local rightists, protecting the leadership. In the cases of the Recruitment group, the Bukharin school, Smirnov's Trotskyist group in 1933, and Kirov's murder, Yagoda and his deputy, Molchanov, whom he had blackmailed into becoming an accomplice back in the late 1920s, moved the investigations to Moscow immediately in order to weaken any connections, and when forced to liquidate the groups, indeed focused on local conspirators so that the leaders could only ever be accused of passive participation or inaction. While making these moves exposed him to possible scrutiny, he was far too deeply involved to do anything else, and the bloc formed between the rightists and the Trotskyites in the early 1930s, combined with the internal strife within the Soviet Union during collectivization, made the group feel nigh untouchable. Invincible. Still, he implemented a so-called parallel center within the GPU/NKVD in the eventuality that the bloc came to power and turned on him. It was after Kirov's assassination that the CC became wary of him, which Yagoda knew. They assigned Yezhov to hold his feet to the fire. When this led to the elimination of the various high-ranking groups, Yagoda felt that, for his own survival, it was time to change tactics. Since most of the major players were off the board, a regime change was unlikely internally, particularly one with him in mind, post-counter-revolution. Knowing that war was on the horizon and assuming that the Soviets would lose to a military attack on the front and a peasant uprising on the rear, Yagoda began to, quietly and subtly, ingratiate himself to the German intelligence systems in order to secure a position in the post-war state. However, he denied that he acted out this part of the plan with any effectiveness or meaningful action, and he was removed from the NKVD before he could make contact with the Germans himself. Still, he admitted that the Germans likely knew about him, since he was connected to them through Radek. Radek met with him in the summer of 1936, as the noose was closing on the neck of the Trotskyists, in order to inquire how much he would be able to protect them. According to Yagoda, he told Radek, Bukharin had connected the two, that he likely wouldn't be able to help at all, given how much power Yezhov had gained over the investigation, but that he would do his best. Yagoda admitted to organizing the murder of Yezhov through his contacts still in the NKVD in order that he wouldn't be discovered. The plan was to use a family member of Yezhov so that it would not look like a political murder. But investigators brought Radek in again based on this new information and asked him about the connection. Radek insisted that Yagoda was full of shit, that Yagoda had told him to connect with the Germans as a part of a super-secret plan of the Central Committee, that he had never met with Yagoda to ask about the prospect of help. He maintained that if this was the intent, Radek would have asked Bukharin to go to Yagoda, since a foundation of trust was already present between them. Radek went on to add detail to this relationship, among many other things, but we don't have the time to cover them in this series. On May 16, 1937, Vyshinsky sent a top-secret message to Stalin and Molotov. He had received a report from the Far Eastern Territory prosecutor, which alleged that certain employees of the NKVD there had been using illegal methods of interrogation. The complaints to the prosecutor stated that some suspects were investigated for 30 to 40 hours straight, others for 16 hours. Under these conditions, one of the prisoners had committed suicide. Vyshinsky recommended an investigation into the regional NKVD office and the immediate instruction that all of these methods cease with a threat of severe punishment. At the same time, Yezhov sent a request to allow the trial of 18 prisoners arrested for sabotage and espionage. At this point, the number of cases was coming in so quickly, the Central Committee could no longer keep up with requests for trials, which typically required CC approval and were addressed one by one. Further, while Putna, a Red Army general, had been arrested after being named in the August 1936 trial, the military conspiracy did not become fully untangled until a number of intercepted communications in early 1937 made clear that certain high-ranking officers were in collusion with the Nazis. Returning to Yagoda, on the 19th of May, after the first group of people he and Radek had implicated were brought in and interrogated, Yagoda revealed more of the plan. This included a frustration which arose in the early 1930s when the block was made between the Trotskyites and Zinovievites. According to Yagoda, Trotsky, having been expelled from the country and cut off from the construction of the USSR, was angry and impatient. But the rightists did not need to be hasty. They had not been exiled or even particularly persecuted. Therefore, the adventurism of Trotsky and Zinoviev was dangerous for them. They began to try to distance themselves from the terror tactics, instead playing the long game of a so-called palace coup at the onset of war. Speaking of war, on the 21st of May, Vyshinsky created a list of people summoned to the upcoming May 25th Military Council meeting. In it, he marks those implicated substantially, such as Tukhachevsky, implicated somewhat, like Rogovsky, and implicated only a little, like Mezhenov. Obviously, this was early in the process, but it is important to note that of the 157, with the request to summon an additional 21, only 28 are marked for investigation. Even more notable is that most of those selected, excluding the highest-ranking officers, operated within the same regions or in the same departments. The list of those entangled increased substantially once the investigation was in full swing, but the clustering of suspects by geography and organization lends credence to the argument that these were organically uncovered, rather than this being a premeditated purge of Stalin's enemies. The next day, Yezhov sent a report to Stalin, listing approximately 4,000 people living in Moscow who had been expelled from the party at various times for participating in anti-Soviet activities. Of those, 2,500 were persons repressed for terrorist or espionage activities. And of those 2,500, 1,150 were unemployed. The logic, as Yezhov explained it, is that unemployed citizens who were formerly persecuted were likely engaged in hostile work. This speaks to a targeted investigation based on the lessons learned regarding the patterns of Nikolaev preceding his assassination of Kirov. Yezhov proposed special measures to address these individuals in a draft resolution. This resolution proposed that those who had belonged to Trotskyite, Zinovievite, or other anti-party groups in Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev should be expelled from any administrative positions. An exception was made for old cadre workers who were at one time involved in those groups but had not shown any activity since. The families of those who had been executed or sentenced to 5 or more years as a result of work for those groups were to be evicted from Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev and moved to non-industrial areas. The areas to which they were moved would be required to provide them with housing, and able-bodied members would be guaranteed work. Those who were not able-bodied would be granted state support. The resolution was adopted by the Central Committee a day later. Clearly, they were preparing for war. A number of German nationals living in the USSR, working with German intelligence, had been arrested in the previous 6 months or so. Several of them were sentenced to execution as a result of sabotage, assassination, and so on. In each case, the execution was dropped to a 10-year prison term in order not to antagonize the Nazis and thus endanger socialists still in Germany. On May 24th, a proposal was adopted by the Politburo to expel Marshal Tukhachevsky and Politburo member Radzatak from the party for participation in espionage work for Nazi Germany. 2 days later, Tukhachevsky agreed to independently disclose everything rather than submit to interrogation. Red Army Commander Yakir would do the same thing a week later. After the military conference announced these arrests, a discussion began amongst those who had suspicions of friends and associates of the arrestees. The conference also, important for the purpose of verifying the validity of the arrests, analyzed and confirmed the details of Tukhachevsky's massive confession booklet. Notably, again, as always, Stalin exercised caution rather than demonstrating the paranoia or bloodthirsty vengeance which is often attributed to him. He would defend people at times when there was inconsistency or ambiguity in the accusations and evidence. It was during these proceedings Bukharin finally requested to be summoned so that he could confess his part in all of this. On the military front, Marshal Voroshilov sent orders on June 11th for all commanders, military commissars, chiefs of staff of regiments, members of military soviets, and heads of political departments to select 2 workers to begin training as deputies. Almost certainly, this was in an effort to ensure that, in the case of treason, there would always be someone who could step in quickly. It would also add further insurance that if a high-ranking member was engaged in subversive or suspicious activity, there would be a democratically selected official, not in the chain of command, to turn them in. On the same day, the Supreme Court of the USSR convened to hear the trial of the arrested military leaders. As was usual, the Western press claimed it was another frame-up, that this one was held behind closed doors, surely because the defendants were military men and wouldn't crack as easily as the others. We now have the transcripts of that closed session, which were classified until a few years ago. Not only do none of the defendants appear to be under duress, but they all give very detailed statements and confessions, with questions and counter-questions. If this was fiction, it would have taken someone of the caliber of Tolstoy, but with the efficiency of a dime store novelist, given that Tukhachevsky had only been arrested 10 days prior, and the others only 4 to 5 days earlier. to imagine that investigators broke them and then fed them each scripts which contained consistent and overlapping evidence, and which all of these men were able to memorize in a few days, is patently ridiculous. Regardless, all were convicted by the military tribunal and shot the following day. But back to Yagoda. On June 16, 1937, driver of the vehicle which picked up Kirov's bodyguard, Borisov, for questioning on December 2, 1934, admitted that Borisov had been killed intentionally, saying, "Mali, who was sitting in the cab with me, ordered me to drive quickly to Smolny. I began to speed. On the way, when someone was crossing the street, Mali ordered me not to turn the car, but to run over those crossing. I received the same order from Mali regarding the traffic policeman on Voynova Street and Chernyshevsky Avenue. However, I did not carry out those orders from Mali. Mali, when the vehicle was at full speed, with his right hand, opened the car door, and with his left, grabbed the steering wheel and quickly turned it to the right. The car turned so sharply to the right, I grabbed Mali by the coat with my right hand, and at that moment completely lost the steering wheel. Seeing that the car had climbed onto the sidewalk at full speed and was quickly moving into the wall of a house, I dropped Mali, grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and turned it sharply to the left. As a result, the car did not crash into the wall of the house, but only caught the passenger door. When I got out of the car, Borisov was dead, lying in the back of the truck. Thus, the incident occurred, not because the car was faulty, as I showed in 1934, but due to the direct fault of Mali, who caused the accident and the murder of Borisov. 2 weeks later, another of the NKVD agents in the truck was interrogated and confirmed the driver's testimony in full. A confession was given by Soviet diplomat Khalkhin about a meeting between himself and German General Milch in Budapest, along with the revelation of a connection between Tukhachevsky and Yagoda. Iona Yakir was, at the time of the meeting, in command of the Ukrainian front, where a large contingent of nationalists would happily join the Nazis. This would mean that an attack by Germany would be most successful there. Khalkhin and Milch discussed, upon the military defeat of the USSR and the subsequent military coup, how the USSR would join Germany, according to Tukhachevsky, and open a southern front together. Yagoda had already created codes and ciphers through which the conspirators and Germans could communicate. On the 17th, Yezhov sent a report to Stalin outlining the need to create and allow troikas, at this point only in the West Siberian territory, to try extrajudicial cases involving insurgents. The NKVD leader there, Mironov, had already arrested 382 people connected with 2 different terrorist organizations, citing a total of 1,317 members identified by them. While cases involving executions previously required Supreme Court approval, the volume coming in was too high. Yezhov made a request to the CC plenum 5 days later, citing 13 different groups, adding, "I have listed only the most important ones. In addition to these, anti-Soviet formations have been uncovered in almost all regions and areas, uniting the rightists, Trotskyists, Zinovievists, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and others. All these anti-Soviet fascist groups, although each had a separate task, were closely connected with each other. Around 1933, when the defeat of the rightists, Trotskyists, and others was finally determined on the initiative of various groups, a united center of centers, some call it a contact center, was created, which united the rightists, Trotskyists, Zinovievists, military conspirators from the NKVD, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and others. The United Center of Centers included Rykov, Tomsky, and Bukharin from the right socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, Yanukidze from the military group and the group of NKVD conspirators, Kamenev and later Sokolnikov from the Zinovievites, and Pyatakov from the Trotskyists. The center of centers, being connected with the fascist government circles of Germany, Japan, and Poland on the one hand, and the foreign representatives of the anti-Soviet parties of Trotskyists, Mensheviks, and socialist revolutionaries on the other, in contact with these circles, using methods of duplicity, developed work in the direction of implementing its plans to seize power. The Central Committee approved the proposal for troikas to be formed to expedite the process of investigation, trial, and sentencing. The final decision of execution still required approval from Moscow. Yagoda's wife was offered the choice of 4 cities where she could relocate from Moscow, where she would be held. She chose Astrakhan, a southern Russian city by the banks of the Volga. This process was followed with several other members of Yagoda's family. That same day, Yezhov's deputy, Fernovsky, sent a top-secret order to all the People's Commissars of the NKVD that, given the infiltration by Yagoda, certainly his loyal agents had shielded many conspiracies, and thus, the leaders needed to review all cases involving probable treason or sabotage. On July 2nd, 1937, the deputy of the NKVD of the Ukrainian SSR sent a request to liquidate the Troika there, since they felt that the inability to carry out sentences made the bureaucratic process more time-consuming with no obvious benefit. A special meeting of the CC Plenum decided that, since the majority of those engaged in terrorist activities were former kulaks or other exiles who had been allowed to return to the territory, that troikas could be formed, with permission to execute in these cases. They were still required, within 5 days, to submit a list of the members of those troikas, and those subject to execution, along with a separate category of those less hostile to be expelled again. This was altered to 1 month later in July. The regional leaders sent lists of the different categories with the numbers that they were requesting, to divide into appropriate categories. These lists were received by Yezhov and then brought to the Politburo, who reviewed and either confirmed the requests or denied them. At some points, the Politburo was meeting 10 or more times in one day to review them. This is the true story of the so-called Stalin killing lists. Stalin neither designed the lists nor determined the sentences. He may have personally seen some of them, but their approval was not his decision to make. At one point, Khrushchev, head of the Moscow Oblast, had to request 2 more people to help review the cases before passing them on to the Politburo, because there were so many. Simultaneously, a rash of mass poisonings began taking place in some of the collective farms. On July 5th, the head of the NKVD for the Omsk region sent a letter to Yezhov. In it, they tell a story of Yagoda's previous boss, Menjinsky, who was feeling ill in 1933, saying that he was close to death. The NKVD head, Stalin, was transferred to Crimea and suggested that Menjinsky come to rest and relax. While he was in Crimea, he mentioned to Stalin that he was actually feeling better without the doctors. Stalin suggested he dismiss them, which he did. After 2 months, he was back to normal, and for the following year, he had no further issues. On a visit to Moscow in April of 1934, Stalin saw him again, and Menjinsky stated that he was back in the care of physicians and feeling ill. At 4 o'clock in the morning on May 1st of that year, a Moscow line rang for Stalin in his apartment in Simferopol. There was a long silence, but eventually, Menjinsky spoke to say that it was too cold for him to come and visit Stalin again. Stalin, confused, responded that it was not at all cold and that he should visit again. But the line suddenly went dead. Stalin immediately called back, but the Moscow operator informed Stalin that the line had been damaged somehow. A few days later, Stalin received news that Menjinsky was dead. The reviews of the Kirov files and the interrogations of those involved found that 2 NKVD officers in Leningrad, in order to hide the fact that Nikolaev had been detained and released twice, destroyed a number of files on the morning of the murder. On the 12th of July, Yezhov's deputy, Franovsky, ordered a stop to the troikas. The leaders were asked to gather information and meet on the 16th to discuss with him and Yezhov how the operation should proceed moving forward. The minutes, resolutions, etc. about that meeting are either not present or not yet available from the archives. Nor are the records of the meetings of the Politburo for reviewing the troikas. We believe it is safe to assume that the volume of cases uncovered and submitted were so large that the Politburo could not afford to keep meeting a dozen times a day. A report from the head of the Ukrainian NKVD to the chiefs of the various departments on July 20th, 1937 reads, People's Commissar Comrade Loplevsky has ordered that by 11 o'clock in the morning, a report signed by you or your deputy on the results of the operational investigative work for the past 24 hours must be submitted to him through me. The report includes the results of interrogations of the most important arrested persons, indicating when he was arrested, what he confessed to, who recruited him, who he names as participants in the conspiracy, who he personally recruited, which of the named persons were arrested, and who confessed. The certificate should include the most interesting facts and data from the testimony of those arrested. The daily report form is attached. The interrogation protocols are to be sent to the People's Commissar immediately after printing, and Comrade Loplevsky has ordered that each interrogation protocol must be accompanied by a certificate signed by the investigator about the persons involved in the testimony, indicating who they are and whether they have been arrested. I have requested that information on the results of the operational investigative work be provided exactly by the specified time. Again, speculating, it seems that this was probably an adjustment made which allowed the Politburo to feel better about delegating the review of each case to the local level. A flurry of reports followed this decision regarding the need to move this NKVD center here, cancel vacations, increase wages, etc. to compensate for the extra work. Quite clearly, things were beginning to spin out of control. The Politburo also approved a measure to arrest all German nationals working in the defense industry and to deport those they believed were high risk. The Soviet government was under the impression that the war with Germany was imminent. On the 20th of July, Stalin received a report that 2 crows had been killed, which had rings attached to their legs with a series of numbers and Germany inscribed on them. Though their purpose was unclear, one supposition was that these birds were being used to study the direction of winds with the aim of sabotage with fire and/or bacteriological agents. A statement was delivered by an NKVD leader in the Far Eastern sector in which he admitted connection among a number of people involved in the military and NKVD conspiracies. This included Alexander Orlov, the guy who exposed the Trotskyites in Spain. He would be notified of this accusation and immediately defect to the United States, where he became a mouthpiece for anti-Soviet propaganda. Further, an earlier report on a large discrepancy in the number of aircraft available versus the number produced led to an investigation which revealed that a large number of Soviet aircraft had been destroyed by sabotage. A telegram came in from Voronezh asking for an increase on the limit of cases which could be categorized for the troikas. It was signed by CC members Molotov, Mikoyan, Kaganovich, and Chubar, as well as Voroshilov and Kalinin from the Supreme Court. Again, Stalin had no hand in this decision, which led to the nightmare which followed. Further evidence against the perspective that he orchestrated the purges, that he was the driving force behind the mass executions. On the 30th of July, the Politburo met again, after more groups were uncovered and further requests for an increase to the limits of those repressed in the Kulak criminal and anti-Soviet operation. The approved lists were specific to each SSR and autonomous region, with clear thought put into each as the numbers between first category, those subject to execution, and the second category, those subject to imprisonment for 8 to 10 years, varies widely by region. Further, the resolution specified, "The approved figures are approximate. However, the People's Commissars of the Republic-level NKVD and the heads of the regional and provincial NKVD departments do not have the right to independently exceed them. Any independent increases in figures are not allowed. The reduction of numbers, as well as the transfer of persons designated for repression under the first category to the second category, and vice versa, is permitted. Families of those sentenced to the first and second categories, as a rule, are not subject to repression." The operations were to be completed within no more than 4 months to avoid an ongoing persecution. Instructions were given for reporting, arrests, record-keeping, confiscation, etc. They were to keep minutes of every meeting. The minutes from troikas were to be sent to the head of the operational group, who would then attach the relevant parts to the investigative files of the convicted persons. Certainly, while we have no idea the true extent of the various conspiracies and terrorist organizations, the Central Soviet government trusted regional leaders to act reasonably and trusted in the evidence of the existence of those conspiracies. The Politburo took precautions, perhaps as much as they realistically could, to prevent this from going off the rails, at least as much as they could, given the threat of an impending and devastating war. And yet, the numbers are difficult to swallow. They were extensive, and a resistance that strong should have warranted a more comprehensive investigation. It should have warranted a realignment of policy to address the contradictions which gave rise to the opposition. Knowing that they were not evil or paranoid, we can only assume that they felt backed into a corner and under pressure to address a difficult problem quickly. It is, of course, easy for us to criticize in hindsight, but criticize we nevertheless should. Perhaps criticize is even the wrong word. We should evaluate the material conditions in which this situation arose, try to understand why these decisions were made, and do our best to learn what lessons we can from the mistakes. All the same, there were so many NKVD operations happening simultaneously. They were pulling hundreds of cadets from the UGB, or State Security School, to send them into the field. For his part, Stalin was attempting to figure out as best he could, from a theoretical standpoint, not having the time or resources to be on the ground. On August 3rd, 1937, he sent a directive to the secretaries and regional committees of the national parties. He felt as though the main reason for continuing discontent among the rural populations was as a result of the NKVD carrying out work, quote, "only in a closed manner," end quote, and directed them to hold, by district, 2 to 3 open trials in order to show the people the reason for these repressions. August 6th, a paper in Frankfurt, a mouthpiece of the Nazi propaganda machine, began to spin wild stories of 500,000 political prisoners being used as slave labor to build the Moscow-Volga Canal with, quote, "no one knows how many dead," end quote. Pot and kettle. The next day, NKVD Deputy Franovsky issued a circular expanding Order 00447, which allowed the repression of kulaks and anti-Soviet conspirators to include cases of armed robbery, robbery with violence, repeat criminals, escapees, unemployed repeat offenders, and non-party persons who were unemployed. These cases were to be sent to the troikas and carried out in, quote, "the shortest time possible," end quote. He asked for the troikas to report to him personally every 5 days with the details of how many cases were considered, how many individuals were executed, how many were sent to prison, and how many robberies were committed within that 5-day span. As far as we can tell, this expansion of Troika power was not reviewed or approved by the CC, the Politburo, nor the Supreme Court. Another circular from the head of the Ukrainian NKVD that same day makes clear that, at least in Ukraine, secrecy was the name of the game. No one was supposed to be present in the interrogation aside from the investigator and one assistant. Reports were only sent to the head of their respective departments, and so on. On the 8th, another memorandum was sent from Franovsky declaring that only convicts of the second category, imprisonment, were to receive the verdict of the Troika. The first category, execution, were to be handled internally by the NKVD. This edict was not signed by the CC, or the Politburo, or Stalin. Not even Yezhov, for that matter. The hints of conspiracy begin to show themselves. The head of the Ukrainian NKVD again sent a memo to NKVD headquarters complaining that the pace of investigation in cases of arrested German subjects was completely insufficient. Quote, "Few have confessed." End quote. A similar request was sent by the head of the Gorbach Krai NKVD. On the 25th of September, this last one was marked reported by telephone, either Franovsky or Yezhov told Gorbach that they could continue executing people under the first category while waiting on approval. The same was done for Novosibirsk on October 23rd. Again, none of this was approved by any member of the Central Soviet government. On the 10th of August, archival materials from the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, and an interrogation of the head of the Gorky Secret Archives was sent to the Central NKVD office about Yagoda's early activities as an anarchist nicknamed Owl, who was an active participant in an anarchist group in Nizhny Novgorod. His involvement in this group, however, was as an informant for the Okhrana. The interrogated employee stated that he had read the file when it was removed by Gorky NKVD director Pogrebinsky. The man could give the file numbers, but not exact dates. On the 17th of August, Colonel Fedorov, head of the Odessa NKVD office, sent a directive to all Ukrainian field offices. In it, he begins by chiding them. He goes on to say that in a meeting between the regional troika and the People's Commissar in Ukraine, he found that the quality of cases submitted were very poor. Some of those arrested weren't even sure why they were being arrested. In a majority of the cases, while the suspects were found guilty of the basic crimes charged, they had nothing to do with any insurgent or sabotage groups. Fedorov gives a number of specific examples in which cases of people who were likely guilty were dropped because the investigation was so poorly handled. In others, suspects were asked questions which had nothing to do with the case, or pressed on topics which the accused had already answered, without any additional evidence to justify the badgering. Fedorov ordered the heads of the inter-district operational groups to check the quality of the investigations, reviewing all files before submission to the Troika. It ends with a warning that if they do not get their shit together, there will be, quote, strict administrative penalties, end quote. On the 20th, the People's Commissar of the NKVD in Ukraine, the one who was complaining about how slow Troika proceedings were going, sent a telegram to Yezhov. The Ukrainian NKVD had a problem. All of the prisons in Ukraine could hold, cumulatively, 24,755 prisoners. As of the date of the telegram, they had 43,000 people in custody. Their solution was to speed up the cases, since only 30 to 50% of those in the first category, execution, ended up in the second category after the trial. As such, execution would relieve the prisons. Throughout this period, virtually nothing is sent before the Politburo for review. We count 5 instances in which Stalin, among others, signed off on increasing particular limits for a region. Largely, the leadership of the USSR were sent requests for assignment or reassignment of this person or that person to this or that troika. Occasionally, for the very serious reports on specific organizations, Yezhov would forward something to Stalin, but under no circumstances was Stalin mindlessly signing off on executions. He would read the report, indicate who he felt needed to be arrested, who needed to be looked into more, and ask what questions he had. In other words, he was concerned and intent on finding the truth. Sadly, most of the details of what was going on at the local level were kept from him and the rest of the CC. At first, interviews and articles showed the relief of the general population at the depth of work being done to root out those enemies of socialism who were consistently undermining it. But by the end of the operation, there were very few who still felt this way. There were other serious cases going on at this time, including one in which a mass infestation of mites among grain reserves was uncovered. Vyshinsky headed this investigation, discovering that terrorists within the State Agricultural Institute had been behind it. Almost 20,000 tons of grain were ruined by this method. Train crashes were happening, ships were being bombed. Real sabotage was taking place, which is why it was so easy to assume that the NKVD was carrying out necessary operations, and why the treason was so easy to hide. Throughout the excesses, Yezhov was sending only the final reports to Stalin, those which declare this group or that group liquidated. It probably felt like a huge success. On October 5th, 1937, the head of the NKVD in Kiev made a report of errors he felt he saw in the operations being carried out through the troikas. They are not dissimilar to the complaints of Colonel Fedorov back in August. And yet, on November 4th, Yezhov, coming up against the 4-month deadline for the operation, sent a letter to the Ukrainian NKVD saying that it was moving too slowly. December 10th was the final day, and there were to be no petitions to extend the deadline. And yet, on December 11th, Yezhov extended the deadline to January 1st, 1938. November 15th, Vyshinsky, as chief prosecutor of the USSR, sent a warning that far too many cases which shouldn't have been sent to the troikas were. He warned that using the special order of the troikas to expedite normal criminal cases was unacceptable. He attached sheets with a number of cases of this type on it. The requests for an increase to the limit for cases was flooding in by the first week of December. The report of the entire operation, once concluded, came out in mid-January. 248,271 former kulaks, 116,506 repeat criminals, 162,594 counter-revolutionaries, and approximately 30,000 uncategorized people were arrested under the operation of Order 00447. Of those, 239,252 people were executed, and 314,110 people were sentenced to prison terms of 8 to 10 years. At the end of December, Yagoda was again interrogated, following information linking him to Maxim Gorky's doctor, L.G. Levin. Levin was also Menjinsky's physician. Here, probably tired from spending months in prison waiting for them to complete his case, Yagoda addresses various connections yet to be made, as well as other issues surrounding the deaths of Gorky, Gorky's son, and Menjinsky. On February 25th, 1938, Yagoda was given the results of his preliminary investigation, after which he declared that he did not have anything to add, did not have any statements to make, and did not want a defense attorney. His trial, along with that of Bukharin, Rykov, Kristinsky, Rakovsky, Rosenholz, and others, was scheduled for March the 2nd of 1938 in Moscow, presided over by the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court. Back on January 14th, 1938, Vyshinsky had ordered that departments carefully check complaints by families of those arrested who were subsequently fired from their jobs. On the 24th, a report from the prosecutor's office named 12 cases which were never sent to them for review, but, upon review, were instances when the evidence against the accused was flimsy at best. And yet, each of the convicted were executed. On the 26th, another report from the prosecutor's office from the head of the Kirov Railway, Vorobyov, said that when the NKVD officer arrived to perform an investigation, he asked for help because the deadlines were tight and there was too much work to do. Vorobyov agreed, since he didn't have anything pressing to do at the time. The agent then called in a number of other people, requesting evidence on such and such a suspect and suggesting such and such a crime. He was, more or less, asking for fabricated evidence against those who were suspected of sabotage. Reports along these lines continued to stream in. Two things were happening simultaneously at this time. On one end, people were trying to unravel the extent of the excesses of the NKVD operation and attempting to hold those responsible accountable. On the other end, the staggering results of the operation were such that the leadership of these areas or departments who had apparently not noticed or willfully ignored all that transpired, therefore allowing it to become an unmitigated disaster, were being criticized publicly and losing their positions. A draft letter in the archives, written by Yezhov but clearly in response to concerns from the NKVD of the Ordzhonikidze region, states, "The consistent blows against the counter-revolution inflicted by the organs of state security had and have as their goal the exposure of all enemy nests and the liquidation of the base and personnel of foreign intelligence services. The main centers of espionage, sabotage, subversive, terrorist, insurgent, and other counter-revolutionary formations have been destroyed. However, in the process of this correctly conducted enormous operational work, there were criminal actions that can be qualified as nothing other than the actions of an enemy who had penetrated our ranks and managed to carry out all this vile sabotage work. In recent months, numerous complaints from citizens about illegal arrests, abuse of those arrested, and other acts of arbitrariness committed by the regional and district administrations of the NKVD for the Ordzhonikidze region have been received by the NKVD of the USSR. A special commission sent to the site established that the majority of the facts of criminal distortions and excesses in the work of the NKVD bodies of the Ordzhonikidze region, as stated in the statements and complaints, actually took place. The regional and district NKVD offices carried out arrests based on random, unverified information on the basis of knowingly false testimony from those arrested, along with real enemies, innocent, honest Soviet people, the best collective farmers, and honest party members were arrested. As a result, for example, in the Soldato-Alexandrovsky district, 227 people were arrested on charges of participating in a right Trotskyist counter-revolutionary organization. Of this number, after an investigation of their cases, more than 100 of those arrested were released, since there were no grounds for their arrest. During the investigation, the employees of the regional apparatus and district departments of the NKVD subjected the arrested to brutal beatings and abuse, using the most ingenious methods. The beaten arrested were then placed in common cells where they were forced to show signs of beatings in order to influence the other arrested persons by the threat of beating. People who had nothing to do with the investigation were involved in the beatings. The beaten prisoners were taken to city outpatient clinics for treatment. They were given visits with family members. All of this was nothing more than a deliberate discrediting of the NKVD organs, a manifestation of blatant hostile activity. In a review of the operation in Ukraine, he wrote, From here, the harmful pursuit of bare quantitative indicators of fulfillment and over-fulfillment of limits inevitably arose and flourished. The scattered anti-Soviet base was arrested, and the leading enemy cadres of the anti-Soviet organizations they headed escaped the blow. Given the extreme weakness of accounting and information work at the beginning of the operation, it was necessary to especially carefully, promptly, and at a high political level direct and conduct work on the operations in order to eliminate the enemy's most active and senior members. Instead, they mostly arrested anti-Sovietists who were insignificant, members of church clergy, church activists, individual bearers of anti-Soviet and anti-Kolkhoz sentiment, rank-and-file rebel and White Guard members, etc., while the most covert and organized Kulak White Guard and spy formations remained undiscovered. The lack of the necessary operational political focus in mass operations also led to the fact that little attention was paid to nationalist formations such as Makhnovists and Petliurists, their connection with foreign immigrant centers, and their intertwining with foreign intelligence services. The frenzy of the main operation, consisting of troikas, was over. But still, by March 1st, an additional 59,000 people had been arrested under Order 00447. With very specific exceptions, no one was allowed increases to the Category 1 limits anymore. It is around this time, perhaps unsurprisingly given the extent of subversive activity over the previous 10 years, that the intelligence services began to plant listening devices in important positions regularly. There were a large number of reports based on these devices from Yezhov to Stalin surrounding the ongoing trial of Bukharin, Yagoda, and the others in the indictment. From every walk of life, intelligentsia, military, factory workers, etc., as well as foreign diplomats. As a general rule, Soviet citizens had no issues believing the legitimacy of the trial, but the foreign diplomats were, at this point, firmly convinced that the entire thing was a plot by Stalin to shore up power for himself. This, of course, is the narrative of anti-communists to this day. On the 12th of March, 1938, the military collegium, consisting of the chairman, Ulrich, his deputies, State Prosecutor Vyshinsky, his secretary, and 2 defense lawyers, convened to discuss sentences for those convicted in the case of the anti-Soviet right Trotskyist bloc. 18 of the defendants, Bukharin, Rykov, Yagoda included, were sentenced to the highest measure of criminal punishment, execution. Pletnev, who was complicit in, but did not take active part in, the murder of Gorky's son and first deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Kubichev, was given 25 years, a special exception to the 10-year rule, generally the maximum prison sentence in the USSR at the time. Under this same exception, Trotsky's old pal, Christian Rakovsky, was given 20 years, and Besanov, a diplomat who confessed to being the primary go-between for the German fascist military and the Trotskyists, was given 15 years. Those with prison sentences had them calculated from the moment of arrest. Essentially, it included time served. As soon as the trial was over, Vyshinsky was frantically trying to mitigate the damage which the NKVD had done and, in some cases, was still doing. On the one hand, it was difficult to walk back anything, because the moment they did, requests poured in from everywhere appealing arrests. On the other hand, they couldn't be allowed to continue. There were 4 times as many complaints received by the prosecutor's office in February and March of 1938 than there had been in the entirety of 1937. There were still many ongoing investigations which were urgent and legitimate, but how would they sort out the truth from lies at this point? Interestingly, head of the NKVD in the Far Eastern Territory, Lyushkov, was a major cheerleader for repression of the military conspiracy, consistently requesting permission to arrest high-ranking Red Army officers. It is interesting because Lyushkov, would soon defect to Japan and state very publicly in the media that the entire military conspiracy didn't exist, and that it was a fabrication from Moscow. On April 11th, Wyszynski sent an order denying district prosecutors from ordering the arrests of anyone connected to counter-revolutionary crimes without approval from the regional prosecutor first. Molotov was sent to review numerous regions. In some areas, more than 50% of the sentences reviewed were changed. Up to 8% of those changed were dismissed altogether, and the rest had sentences reduced or reclassified, expunged or overturned, with cases set for further review. Overwhelmingly, the people in those regions were elated with Stalin, whom they credited for looking out for them and making sure that they were not victims of injustice. By mid-May, Wyszynski was sending orders and warnings for all sorts of departments around the Union. By the end of May, there was a 44% decrease in the number of people arrested as compared to April. On the other end, the results of the investigation from the previous summer's military tribunal were coming to fruition for good or ill. These were much more well orchestrated, with cases and evidence compiled and kept in the archives even to this day. How many were genuine or not will require an investigation at a later date, as we do not have the time to do so now. On the 11th of September, Yezhov's deputy, Frenovsky, was relieved of duty, with the Politburo appointing Lavrenti Beria in his place. Immediately, overhauls were made to the structure and function of the NKVD. It was divided into 3 sections: state security, economic, and transport. Those were then subdivided, creating a system less susceptible to manipulation by small groups of individuals. On September 23rd, Yezhov sent a letter to the Politburo laying out the things he felt, or perhaps pretended to feel, he had failed at in allowing these excesses, primarily by not bringing any concerns before the Politburo or the CC, and instead trying to find solutions himself. He requested to be relieved of his duties. The CC ordered Yezhov, Beria, Wyszynski, Rychkov, and Malenkov to develop a new directive on the issue of arrests, prosecutorial supervision, and conduct of investigations by the NKVD. A report from November states that from October 1st, 1936, to November 1st, 1938, the NKVD arrested 1,391,215 people, and nearly 668,000 were put to death. Following an in-depth review of those prisoners still alive, 12,903 were released, and 40,000 sent back for further investigation. A complaint came in from one of the former heads of the first department of the NKVD. He tells the story of Yezhov as a man who was drunk all the time, that he was careless and obsessed, that when Beria was assigned, Yezhov burned many records on the NKVD employees under his command. On November 24th, Yezhov's request to be relieved of duties was granted. Beria moved into the role of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. On August 4th, 1939, Yezhov's interrogation record gives an outline to the plot. It's possible that this was a conscious conspiracy. It is also possible that Yezhov confessed or was told to confess to a conspiracy in order to give everyone a way to clean up the mess, so named Yezhovchina, in a way which would feel complete. We don't have enough information to make a judgment call either way at this point, as only a small portion of the remainder of this investigation has been made available so far. Beria cleaned house as the new People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. He dug into thousands of cases, trying to clear anyone he suspected was innocent, going back through the files from 1927 onward. he moved all requests for pardon away from the power of the NKVD and into the hands of the Supreme Soviet in order to create more transparency. We must acknowledge the failures, tragic failures of this operation, one born out of a necessity to address the very real cases of treason and sabotage, one which yielded very real results, one which might have made the difference between the Soviet Union surviving the coming war or being crushed between two fronts, one within and one without. But instead, this operation will forever be marred by perhaps the most legitimate bourgeois criticism of this era. It is also important to note that there are some narratives of this period which are false, demonstrably false. The idea that there was no military conspiracy is false. There are a number of intercepted letters from the Nazis to members of it, not to mention the mountain of investigative work. We also have OSS interrogations from Nazis admitting to it. The idea that the convictions of the high-profile trials were based solely on confessions is also false. There are mountains of letters, confiscated counter-revolutionary texts, weapons, and other such incriminating evidence. The farce of the rehabilitations is also false, dangerously so. The archives have contained hundreds of complaints, responses, requests, and decisions with regards to the NKVD, particularly Operation 00447 under Yezhov. Khrushchev and those who came after him could have declassified and released all files related to this period, and it would have painted a much clearer picture of what was going on. But they chose not to, instead cherry-picking tiny portions of speeches or letters from Stalin to make it look like he was responsible, because if they had released the more incriminating information, it would have been clear that he wasn't involved any more than any other member of the Politburo. Our conclusions episode to the Stalin Eras will touch on these in a bit more detail. But now, we must move on from the domestic concerns of the USSR and examine the wider world.
War is already here. From a non-Eurocentric view, the global conflict known as World War II had already begun in Asia by 1937. Known in a scholarly context as the Second Sino-Japanese War, this conflict is more accurately known in China as the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression. While Japan had occupied significant portions of Chinese territory since 1931, it did not mount a full-scale invasion of China until the summer of 1937. Despite a long, bloody rivalry, Chinese communists, in a bid for survival, now found themselves in a united front with their domestic adversary, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang Party and the Republic of China. The genocidal campaign unleashed by Japan on China led to a major uptick in support from the Soviet Union.
Soviet Russia is much more involved in the Far East than it is in Spain. China is in effect fighting Russia's war, and Russia fully realizes that every additional blow administered to Japan will make her own position that much stronger,
wrote one British diplomat of this era. Typical of British elites both then and now, the international anti-imperialist struggle waged by the USSR could only be understood as a fully self-serving act, rather than that of a collective proletarian struggle. As the anti-fascist struggle raged on in the Iberian Peninsula, the Soviets made the tough but strategic decision to reduce, though not stop, the amount of material support to the Spanish Republic through 1937 and 1938. This was done to funnel their finite resources to the Chinese resistance, as well as to counter the more immediate threat posed by border skirmishes with Japan. Border skirmishes which had been interpreted as testing the boundaries preceding a full-scale invasion. First Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Vladimir Potemkin, is noted as expressing hope that the Chinese resistance would ultimately make Japan incapable of successfully invading the USSR. On this point, he was correct. However, we will soon see that the Red Army directly contributed to this outcome as well. Through 1938, the Soviet Union found itself split on two fronts, fighting undeclared anti-imperialist wars against a united faction of fascist states, which had cultivated extensive anti-Soviet networks within its borders. By early 1939, the fascist rebel forces of General Francisco Franco had thoroughly defeated the remnants of the Spanish Republican government. Franco's new regime quickly achieved official recognition by the Western powers. Soon after, an increasingly embattled Stalin was provided with a comprehensive debriefing on the Spanish Civil War by the Spanish Communist Party, who gave him some sense of clarity on what was, or rather what wasn't, possible when it came to forming an anti-Hitler coalition in Western Europe. At this point, it had been 6 years since the USSR began in earnest to form such a coalition with Britain and France. 6 years of failure and rebuffs from their supposed allies. And after having exposed high-ranking conspiracies and uncovering networks of numerous sabotage and other anti-Soviet intelligence operations on Soviet soil, it was clear to Stalin that the window to prevent an apocalyptic attack on the socialist motherland was narrowing. Soviet leadership was of the position that the governments of Britain, France, and other Western powers were chomping at the bit for Nazi Germany to unleash their genocidal program against the USSR and end the communist menace once and for all. However, they also knew this was not the position of everyday people in Western Europe, who were both better at reading geopolitical situations and more humane than their liberal democratic leadership. For example, a Gallup poll indicated that an overwhelming 87% of Britons were in support of forming a collective security alliance with France and the USSR. It was only a year prior that the Munich Agreement, heavily promoted by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, resulted in the dismemberment and absorption of Czechoslovakia by Germany to satisfy the Nazi thirst for Lebensraum. A process which ended in May of 1939 with the entire country beyond the Sudetenland now under total Nazi rule. In the same month, to the shock of many, Maxim Litvinov, the People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, resigned. As is common in political cabinets, individual persons take the blame for carrying out failed policies from the top. Then they are forced out, either through firing or resignation, to signal a change or refresh of state policy. This was no different in Litvinov's case. His resignation was considered the end of an era, as for a decade he had symbolized a foreign policy of peace secured through alliance of the world's democratic forces. But such alliances had failed to materialize throughout the 1930s. They had failed to save Ethiopia, Spain, Austria, and most recently, Czechoslovakia. Each of these nations found themselves sacrificed at the altar of liberal democracy to appease the gods of fascism. For a taste of the theatrics the West engaged in regarding these failed negotiations to build an alliance, here is an example of who earnestly sought peace and who didn't, as noted in the 1961 text, The Origins of the Second World War.
The diplomatic exchange shows that delays came from the West and the Soviet government answered with almost breathtaking speed. The British made their first tentative suggestion on April 15th. The Soviet counterproposal came 2 days later on the 17th of April. The British took 3 weeks before designing an answer on the 9th of May. The Soviet delay was then 5 days. Thereafter, the peace quickened. The British tried again in 5 days' time, and the Soviet answer came within 24 hours. If dates mean anything, the British were spinning things out, and the Russians were anxious to conclude. There is other evidence that the British treated negotiations in a casual way, more to placate public opinion than to achieve anything.
Historian Louis Namier, in writing in a similar vein, in the 1940s noted,
It had been a mistake on part of the British government, so quick, unstinting, and easy about terms when handing out guarantees to second and third-rate powers, to have treated Soviet Russia like a suppliant, and to have started off with suggestions which were both ludicrous and humiliating. It was a further mistake to have gone on haggling about every concession, which rendered it ungracious and unconvincing. It was a third mistake to have sent a junior official to negotiate with Russia, and later on servicemen of less standing than were sent, for instance, to Poland or Turkey. Behind it all was a deep, insuperable aversion to Bolshevist Russia, such as was not shown in dealings with Hitler or Mussolini. And whether it was justified or not, it was certainly not conducive to success in very difficult negotiations.
Regardless, Litvinov was out. Vyacheslav Molotov, close ally and friend of Stalin and longtime Soviet diplomat, was in. The general response from those following Soviet foreign policy closely can be summed up by Alexandra Kollontai, who was then the acting ambassador to Sweden for the USSR. She recorded the following in her diary. Assessing the international situation, she wrote, "It means that we are entering a new world war. London is to blame, of course. The spirit of Munich will also destroy us. The Soviet Union is clearly forced to defend itself against the Nazis. It is necessary to prepare the Soviet people for war. Look at me talking, the old pacifist." Publicly, she told people to find understanding by reading the Soviet papers and task communiques, which she understood to be perhaps downplaying the significance of the moment. She continued in her diary, stating, "We had to calm people down, our own and foreigners. No, I kept saying, this is not a change in the course of our foreign policy, but it should show London and Paris that the patience of the Soviet people has run out, that the time for persuading and negotiating with them is over." She later mused, "I understand that in Moscow it is more convenient to have not Litvinov, but a new figure at the helm of the NKVD. But is Molotov such an aggressive man and a military specialist?" This shift in personnel seemed to have the desired effect on Berlin, where the press was directed shortly after to cease all polemical attacks on the Soviet Union and Bolshevism. The Soviets had begun to lay the groundwork for the ultimate Hail Mary to delay a Nazi invasion. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, wrote somewhat delusionally about this news.
"I am skeptical of the value of Russian help, that I should not feel our position was greatly worsened if we had to do without them."
Despite his distaste for the USSR, Chamberlain recognized that the negotiations with Moscow were necessary, even if ultimately there was no alliance to be reached. The appearance of progress in that direction was deemed valuable, both as a deterrent to Hitler's aggression against Poland, as well as to satisfy the growing anger among the British public and in Parliament against the now discredited policy of appeasement. And so the talks continued, limply, under Molotov. While the same game was played, the Soviets replying promptly and urgently to proposals, while the British often took several weeks to respond. But as Kollontai noted, the patience of the Soviet people had now run out, and they weren't going to play anybody's fool.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Months before the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, Stalin received a comprehensive report from head of military intelligence Semyon Uritsky. It detailed the war preparations and destabilizing efforts by Imperial Japan, which were steadily ramping up. This extensive report contextualized contemporary infiltration within a long history, going back to the late 19th century through the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 and World War I. It specifically noted that Japanese activity was especially intense in recent years, and that this followed a classic pattern. Once Japanese intelligence targeted an area for military intervention, they first filled that area with spies and sabotage groups. This had been the case in Korea, Manchuria, and Shanghai, and was now occurring in Mongolia and the Soviet Far East. This report, among other classified and yet to be declassified materials, encouraged the highest echelons of Soviet government to carry out a series of mass operations, which led to arrests, deportations, and executions in the Soviet Far East. Notably, after the outbreak of war in China, the problem-plagued population transfer of almost 172,000 Soviet Koreans on the border to the Central Asian republics was carried out in September 1937. This mass operation marked the start of large-scale ethnic deportations in the USSR which occurred during the war years. While clearly motivated, rightly or wrongly, by concerns about subversionary elements in these border populations, in the case of Soviet Koreans at least, pro-Soviet sources have argued the deportations were conducted in part to save Soviet Koreans from being exposed to the extermination campaigns and wartime brutality Imperial Japan had wrought all over Asia. We note this now not only to underscore the dire wartime state of affairs in the Soviet Far East in the late 1930s, but also to demonstrate further why Stalin and his team found it strategically necessary to shift their military focus from supporting the Spanish Republicans to securing their own borders. We assure you we're not being facetious here. We ask that our listeners take the time, right now, to look at a map of the world. Observe. The only way the Soviets could have realistically preserved the left-wing government of the Spanish Republic militarily would have been to send Red Army forces far from the war readiness they would achieve by 1941 through a hostile, fascist-friendly Western Europe. The unwelcome movement of troops in Western Europe would have undoubtedly provided pretext for an apocalyptic anti-communist invasion of the Soviet Union. Now observe. The large border shared between modern-day Russia with Mongolia and China, which, at the time, was being invaded or already occupied by Imperial Japan. It simply is not a materialist position to consider it more feasible to have decided on a mad dash through Western Europe over more immediate border concerns. No one in the USSR, least of all Stalin, rejoiced in the fall of the Spanish Popular Front government in 1939. Whatever conflicts arose between international left-wing forces there, the reality is that without the prolonged support of the Soviet Union, their government would have been crushed, mercilessly, in 1936. Now, back to the Far Eastern Front. Within a week of Litvinov's sacking, which signaled a new Soviet foreign policy in Western Europe, border skirmishes on the Mongolian-Manchurian frontier, precipitated by the Imperial Japanese Army, began to heat up quickly. These skirmishes then erupted into a full-blown military conflagration, which is not popularly known in the West. A conflict which one modern historian called, quote, the most important battle of World War II you never heard of, end quote. From May to September 1939, the Red Army and People's Army of Mongolia engaged in combat with Imperial Japan in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, known in Japan as the Nomahan Incident. The Red Army forces were led by then little-known General Georgy Zhukov, who, as the result of the recent Red Army purges, found himself quickly rising through the ranks. That summer, the Japanese strength at the border was estimated at around 80,000 soldiers, 180 tanks, and 450 aircraft. Soviet strength had reached approximately 50,000 soldiers, supported by 498 tanks and armored vehicles, along with 581 fighter planes and bombers. The months of intense fighting was made difficult by quicksand, deep ravines, and sand dunes characteristic of the region. Varying estimates have casualties into the multiple of tens of thousands. This was more than the border skirmishes, which has typified Soviet-Japanese relations this decade. This was an undeclared war, and while this war continued in the Soviet Far East, the Western powers had all but surrendered to Hitler's expansive ambitions. The only play available to the USSR after the fall of Spain was to make a deal with the devil, to delay fascist expansion from the West, and to avoid war on two fronts. In a Politburo meeting in August 1939, Molotov was authorized to engage swiftly and seriously with his Nazi counterpart, Joachim von Ribbentrop, for a diplomatic solution. Neither side was ready for war with the other and had more immediate concerns. The simple non-aggression pact with a 10-year duration which was drafted went beyond peace when one reads between the lines, and ironically towards military defensiveness against each other. This can be seen in the secret protocols of the pact, which saw Eastern Europe divided into spheres of influence between the two powers in the case of a euphemistic, quote, sudden political realignment in Europe, end quote. Spheres of influence which correlated heavily to future war buffer zones, resource centers, and manufacturing hubs. Through this agreement, the Soviets had obtained influence over the Baltics, a region the USSR was forced to abandon during the Civil War 20 years prior, despite the existence of short-lived Soviet republics in the region. Little known in the West is that central to these talks was the Soviet goal of reaching a definitive conclusion to the undeclared war in the East. Though the Soviets were outmatching their foe on the eastern border, the prolonged conflict was draining. Knowing the close diplomatic ties between Japan and Germany, Molotov angled during the discussion of the Non-Aggression Pact for Germany to exert influence over its ally in order to rein in its imperialist intentions against the USSR. This point is clear in the documentary record. Nazi German Ambassador Schulenburg, summarizing his early talks with Molotov, noted, quote, "Finally, and this seems to me the most important point, M. Molotov demanded that we cease to support Japanese aggression." A few days later, on August 16, 1939, Schulenburg was ordered by Ribbentrop to inform Molotov that the Germans were ready to conclude a non-aggression pact and, quote, to exercise influence for an improvement and consolidation of Russian-Japanese relations, end quote. After a few more discussions, Ambassador Schulenburg provided Molotov a summary of their agreements. "We are in agreement with the idea that a non-aggression pact, a guarantee of the Baltic states and Germany exercising influence on Japan. While the Soviets in part signed this pact to press German influence over Japan, they were still determined to follow through with a complete military victory at Khalkhin Gol. In fact, as talks were finalizing, Zhukov led the Red Army and soldiers of the Mongolian People's Republic on a final offensive to smash the Japanese Sixth Army. The resilient Japanese put up a fight, but gradually their soldiers came to realize the flimsiness of the official propaganda regarding the invincibility of the Imperial Army. They suffered incredibly heavy casualties without winning a single battle in months. General Zhukov, in his autobiography, recalled, "Great attention was then paid in the Japanese army to ideological brainwashing of soldiers against the Red Army. Our army was pictured as technically backward and was compared in combat capacity to the old Tsarist army back in the days of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. That is why the Japanese soldiers saw during the Battle of the Khalkhin Gol, when they were subjected to the powerful assault of Soviet tanks, aviation, artillery, and well-organized infantry, came to them as a big surprise." Also in his autobiography, Zhukov published a letter received from Mongolian comrades at the conclusion of the conflict, which read, "Dear brothers, men of the Red Army, we brave commanders and political officers of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army, operating in the Khalkhin Gol area, send you the warmest greetings in the name of the entire working people of Mongolia. You, the defenders of our land against the Japanese invaders, and congratulate you on the successful encirclement and complete rout of the samurais who had stolen into our country. Our people will inscribe in golden letters in the history of their struggle for freedom and independence your heroic fight against the Japanese horde in the area of Khalkhin Gol. Were it not for your fraternal and selfless aid, we would not have had an independent revolutionary Mongolian state. Were it not for the aid of the Soviet state, we would be faced with the same lot as that of the people of Manchuria. Japanese invaders would have overrun and plundered our land and our hard-working herdsmen. This has not happened and will never happen, because we are being helped and saved from a Japanese invasion by the Soviet Union. Thank you, and many thanks to the Soviet people. Zhukov himself concluded, "The men of the Mongolian army admired the fighting skills of the Soviet troops, but we Soviet soldiers too were no less delighted by the heroic exploits of the Mongolian troopers and their commanders." The Japanese defeat was so devastating and thorough, they had to regroup and revise their imperialist strategy in the years following, looking for softer targets in East Asia and the Pacific. For example, the military outpost of another encroaching empire located on the occupied territory of Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Germany, as a result of the agreements made regarding the Non-Aggression Pact, also exerted their influence in this direction. As noted by historian and anthropologist Dennis Bartel, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol did not receive much attention in Western mass media at the time, which was more focused on the aftermath of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and on the Nazi invasion of Poland, which happened at roughly the same time frame. As a result, the importance of this undeclared war on the Soviet borderlands is still unknown to most people in the West. As the Non-Aggression Pact was signed on August 24, 1939, to the shock and confusion of many, Stalin rightly understood that the Soviet Union had saved their socialist experiment from fighting an unwinnable war on two fronts. After 3 years of social upheaval, purges, and trials, it appeared the external threat had been addressed as well. Finally, a brief respite from the storm of capitalist encirclement had been reached. But the question remained. For how long? A week later, on September 1st, 1939, Nazi forces steamrolled Poland. In the eyes of Western Europe, this was the emergence of a new cataclysmic global conflict which was now encroaching on their borders. But this did little to trouble Stalin. After all, from the Soviet Union's perspective, they had been at war for years. That about does it for this episode of the Stalin Eras. We want to thank all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are D. Miraz, Matthias, Fiddy Goats, Graham, Gunner, Julian K., Puscara, Beef Drip, Heriberto, Adrian, Brandon, Cosmic Crown, Kevin, ! Devin, Sekrith Salvexta, Nick, Jack, Sam, Fun Times, Charles, Eduardo, Haney, Dan Marks, Gil, and Lupe. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard subscribers, Paul, Carlos Marks, Talking Socks, and
Comrade
Chihuahua.
If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. And he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.